Well, if you thought you knew Wimbledon like we did, you are going to be amazed when you hear how this tournament used to be nothing like it looks like today.
We're going to tell you the entire story right now on Dynastic.
You know, Wimbledon is a dynasty. It's not a team. It's not a player. It's not an owner. It's not a strategy, but it is the tournament itself. And the argument that we're essentially making to you guys, the audience out there, what Jay and I believe here is that, look, it's not quite true to say Wimbledon invented in every version of tennis. People had been hitting balls over things for centuries, but Wimbledon gave modern tennis its shape, its actual size of the court, the mythology, the dress code, the rituals, the stage, its identity. If tennis exists without Wimbledon, I don't know what it is. It's just a different sport. Frankly, Jay, it might just be squash.
And it's not so much that Wimbledon is tennis exclusively, but to so many people, tennis is Wimbledon, right? Growing up in the Czech Republic, Martina Navratilova, who we'll be talking about a lot later on, the only tennis that was available for her to watch in her home country was Wimbledon. In the 1980 movie, Bon Voyage, Charlie Brown and Don't Come Back, Snoopy and Woodstock, they go to London. What do? They play tennis at Wimbledon. I don't know how Snoopy got court time there, but he had it like that. But that's what you do. If you go to Wimbledon, you think of London.
Snoopy was wearing his all whites, J.A. That did help, right?
Woodstock was not conforming though. He was still in the yellow. But it's funny though. Speaking of Woodstock, like to a lot of people, tennis became, Wimbledon is like Woodstock, right? In terms of the festival, the celebration of this art form.
Look, I have it in my own household. My wife said one of her bucket list events of this great sporting events, the one it's at the top of her list. She's not a huge tennis fan. It's to go to Wimbledon.
And what's interesting is that we'll talk about this too. Wimbledon, it really is a place, right? I mean, the formal
it is an actual place
of the tournament, right, is the championships at the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club in Wimbledon. But it's Wimbledon for better or for worse. And that's what's become, what's interesting to me too, is that you think of all the great sporting events, they have the article, they have it's the World Cup, the Olympics, the Super Bowl. Right. Wimbledon is just Wimbledon. The Wimbledon would sound strange.
And it is one word. And you know exactly what you're talking about. You know what sports you're talking about. You know what, and immediately it evokes a lot of things. If you're an American, it evokes breakfast at Wimbledon, the most unique Americanization of a European event that you can come up with. I mean, the ultimate, and yet one could argue it was one of the greatest reinventions in Wimbledon history.
Yeah, and the television and just the culmination. I think one of the themes we'll be talking about is just the timing, how everything came together to really make Wimbledon what it was, especially for us Gen Xers, Chuck, that we really came of age, I think, at the peak time of Wimbledon.
Well, think about it. You and I are in our mid-50s. The very first time that Wimbledon was televised live, a Wimbledon final was televised live in the United States, was 1979. I was 7. And I remember it distinctly because my parents woke me up to make sure we watched Breakfast at Wimbledon because it, in the 3 TV channel era, it was a thing that year. Do you have that memory?
I don't remember the first one. It's funny because to me, Wimbledon, just as I started getting into sports, and Wimbledon had arrived, Breakfast at Wimbledon was a thing, but it was a thing, and then I very quickly had the desire to go. I never wanted to be a full-time tennis writer, but I knew I wanted to get into being a sports writer or a sports columnist. And I did have Wimbledon on my bucket list. I can't think of anyone involved in sports in any way, fan, journalist, whatever, who doesn't have Wimbledon on their bucket list. And I was fortunate enough to get to cover it twice in 1995 and in 2000.
And in the American sports calendar, look, I this is one of those, what ifs, but if Wimbledon's not in July, is it as important to Americans? It happens to fill a kind of an empty space on the sports calendar, although as you and I were discussing the other day, the July calendar has gotten, the month of July has gotten better for the sports world over the years. If you're an NBA free agency fanatic or you love the British Open, but for the most part, what really helped Wimbledon's success here in the United States was, no other major sport was really out. Even baseball would be in its all-star break during the fortnight of Wimbledon.
Not a whole lot of competition. And you mentioned Fortnite, and that, to me, that's part of the power of Wimbledon. It affected the lexicon, right? We feel like we only use Fortnite in conjunction with Wimbledon, same as we only use score when we're referencing the Gettysburg Address, right? Fortnite, for those not familiar, means a 2-week stretch, just like score means a 20-year period. So, yeah, it helped affect the lingo, the way we use terminology. How many people think of love? There's a rap lyric, much love like Wimbledon, right? Like the love is in the score, right? The amore.
All right, if you really want to know, by the way, the origin story of love it's from the French word for egg, and it was originally like aloof, right? Goose egg. And it just sort of got Americanized. Yeah. Among the sort of fun facts that, as you guys know, and hopefully you've been following us on Dynastic, J.A. and I love to impress each other with the weird facts that we come up with during our research. And it was one of my favorites.
Trivial matters. I did not know one.
Yeah. Underscored the word.
How did it go from eggs, though, to bagel? Because now we talk about, Six Love, they got bagels. But I didn't know that originally it was an egg.
Well, and I could argue goose egg, right? All those, same type of thing. It's a zero. And what I love originally is that it was supposed to be 15, 30, 45, like a clock. That's where the scoring came from. And eventually the 45, instead of 45, it just got shortened to 40. And that's how
rolls off the
40 a little bit easier. But originally, the whole idea of 15, 30, 45, it was following the face of the clock. So these are just I'll call them fun facts. You can call them dumb facts that we think make this a lot of fun.
I've learned a lot already, Chuck. Let's dive in.
Well, let's go. All right. We're going to start. It's 9:15 on a Sunday night in 2008. The end of the fortnight of Wimbledon in 2008 in London. The most famous tennis court in the world is running out of light. There's no roof yet. This would be the last match without a roof on center court. There's no artificial bubble protecting center court from the potential rain delays that can always make Wimbledon a little more unique and interesting. There's no final set tiebreaker at this point, waiting to rescue everyone from what are the ancient absurdity of Wimbledon rules to end a match. Just two men dressed in white, standing on chewed up grass. Almost 5 hours of tennis and more than 7 hours of real time because Wimbledon has spent the whole day being Wimbledon. Rain delay, restart, rain delay, restart. And now the sun is almost gone. Roger Federer is on one side of the net. He's won Wimbledon 5 straight years. Center court is his personal front lawn. He's elegant, he's calm, he's nearly perfect, or at least that's the mythology of Federer. Rafael Nadal is on the other side. He's 22. He's left-handed. He's sleeveless. He's relentless. He's beaten Federer that year in Paris. This is not Paris. This is Wimbledon. If Paris was Nadal's kingdom, Wimbledon was Federer's kingdom. And before they walked out, they passed a photograph of Borg and McEnroe from 1980. The match every Wimbledon final had been measured against for nearly 3 decades. And these two men went out and replaced it.
So this is the thing that people often miss. Wimbledon has this country club image. The sport of tennis, really, in its entirety, literally a country club sport. But at Wimbledon, you think of the royal box and the strawberries and cream and the private members club, all that. But the competition itself is really primitive. There's no teammates. There's no huddles. There's no clock. No coach coming out to draw up a play, right? For so long in tennis, coaching was forbidden during the match. There's no corner man like in boxing. Cut me, Mick. No one can save you. So it's one human trying to break another human being in silence while thousands of people watch.
I know it's this elite thing, and yet in some ways it's the closest thing we have to gladiators that go back. In 2008, Wimbledon itself was being tested. How long could this old tournament hold on to its old ways until it got in the way? How much drama can grass, rain, silence, and darkness produce? What happens when the most tradition-bound tournament in sports gives us a match that modern Wimbledon will never again allow to happen this way? because by the fifth set, officials are making contingency plans. If the light goes completely out, the championship would have to continue on Monday. And we're in the fifth set. It is at this point, I believe it's 7-6. No, excuse me. It is 8-7 at this point with Nadal ahead. Plans are quietly being made to prepare to suspend the match if Federer wins the next point. Imagine that. The Wimbledon men's final, the defining match of a generation, split across 2 days because the tournament still belongs to the weather, but it doesn't happen. Nadal serves for the title. Federer fights. The court goes dark. Television makes it look like the lights are still on, but if you were there at center court, you knew you could not actually see everything as well as you should. There may only be a few minutes of light left. Federer's forehand catches the net. Nadal drops on his back, and Wimbledon gets its perfect ending. The old tournament in its old form, giving us one last masterpiece before the roof arrives the following year and changes yet another tradition.
To understand how we got to that night, to Federer, Nadal, the center court, the grass, the white clothes, the rain, the silence, the mythology. We have to go all the way back before Federer, before Nadal, before Borg and McEnroe, before television, before professional tennis, before tennis was even called tennis. Because the greatest tournament in the history of the sport began basically because a croquet club needed money for a broken lawn roller.
I mean, a broken lawnmower. The greatest, most tradition-bound tournament starts because of a broken lawnmower. Look, before we get started, we want to remind you to please follow us on social media at Dynastic Pod. Follow, like, and review us wherever you listen to your podcast on your YouTube or on our YouTube channel. And from there, let's get rolling. To get started, before we get into our long history of Wimbledon, let's open up the trophy case, J.A.
Yeah, we'll see what's inside there. The Venus Rosewater dish, that's the dish that the women hold up. I know that's in there. The men's trophy, I don't recall the name of, but we've seen so many people hold it aloft.
They have a trophy. The women's have a plate. We'll let other people decide what kind of gender commentary they're saying, but we should remember Wimbledon didn't have equal pay until 2007, the last of the four major tournaments to have equal pay between men and women.
So the United States, and we'll talk about how the U.S. really came to dominate and help define Wimbledon, but the United States has by far the most titles, accounting for singles, doubles, and mixed doubles. U.S. has accounted for 87 championships at the championships. Great Britain's at 73. Australia, shout out to Rod Laver, they're third at 27.
Yeah, it feels like Rob Laver might have half of those, right? France and Germany also in double digits. They're at 15 and 13. And then you go Switzerland, although at this point, it obviously Borg and Federer have been one-man machines for their country. That's for sure.
And so of the 13 Wimbledon singles titles the U.S. has won since 2000, only one of those was won by a man. It was Pete Sampras. And the women have accounted for the other dozen.
Let's do a quick little, is this, and look, we're going to do this every once in a while, interlude. You have a good explanation of what's happened to men's tennis? There's a lot of theories out there.
I don't. I think part of it is that, for, the rise of the female athlete, right? So really two, maybe even three generations past Title IX, and tennis was such an early advocate and early place for women, right? Tennis had a head start on a lot of other sports when it came to female athletes. And so, I really think that came to fruition, and it's been this extended run that women, like there really hasn't been a fall off for women.
By the way, it's very similar actually to another arguably international sport where we've seen this, we've seen in, at least for the American side, the same development, and that's soccer, right? The American women have won the World Cup multiple times. The American men are hoping to just get to like the quarter someday, and that would be a victory. It is, I feel like it's a similar, in some ways you could see the similar trajectory in tennis.
And I think soccer is more extreme because in team sports, there's just so many more options. It has been so many more options for men. for talented athletes, where soccer wasn't even on the radar for, people always say, like, can you imagine if you had like LeBron James and Steph Curry on the U.S. men's national soccer team instead of the basketball team, how dominant that team could be. Although I don't know how good Steph Curry.
I'm sorry. Well, look, we know Trinity Rodman is a great soccer player. Imagine Dennis Rodman in goal, right? Like, right there, here's Mr. Rebound. Like, he'd have been amazing. But we're digressing here. This is about tennis. This isn't about soccer. By the way, the longest matches ever here is, and this is one, and we're going to talk about a little bit ever, but Isner Mayhat, 2010, 11 hours, 5 minutes, 3 days. The final set was 70-68. What's interesting about this is Isner would be in another one of the other longest. He may have played the combined 2 longest matches in Wimbledon history if you combine them together.
That's cruel and unusual. The longest final was Djokovic versus Federer in 2019. That went just under 5 hours, 4 hours, 57 minutes, 68 games, 422 points, 35 aces. That's the
first tournament with the 12-12 tiebreaker fifths when they changed the rule for the fifth set into a 12-12. So, that one might have gone much longer, if that. Most women's singles titles, Martina Navratilova at 9, 6 consecutive. It is the Martina run. It is something that wasn't as appreciated at the moment as I think history has been kinder to her.
And then, Roger Federer with the most men's titles at Wimbledon with 8. But the fact that Martina, not just that dominant run, but the extended, the way she stretched it out, thanks to doubles and mixed doubles. So she won her final Wimbledon championship at age 46. That was a mixed doubles championship in 2003.
Would you want to play her in tennis right now? I think she'd.
Oh, no way. She was smoking.
No chance.
The most overall titles, Navratilova shares that with Billie Jean King, 20 singles, doubles, and mixed doubles. That's for men or women, right? 20 is the standard with Martina and Billie Jean King, both sharing that number.
There's an estimated 150,000 portions of strawberries and cream are served every year. And J.A., as somebody who has covered Wimbledon, in the book that I read in Strokes of Genius, the author basically admits maybe the single worst concessions there are at any major sporting event around the world are the Wimbledon concessions. The strawberries and cream, the best they can do.
Yeah, and I gotta say, the strawberries and cream, disappointing.
Oh no!
I was so looking forward to.
Let me guess, you want some whipped cream, right? We need to Americanize it.
More like my Cool Whip, right? And by cream, they mean like the cream that's in your coffee, right? That's what they mean by cream, which was a surprise to me. Literally, they handed me this. I'm like, why are my strawberries in this milk?
Where's my Cool Whip?
That's the cream. That's the cream. I thought it'd be frothier, right, and have more heft and weight to it.
Give me some Ready Whip. So the real advice is, if you're going to go to Wimbledon, buy your own can of Ready Whip. Don't do any whippets while you're there. Get your own and use that on the strawberries.
I'm not sure you can get an aerosol can through security.
Over 52,000 tennis balls are used for every tournament. That's a lot of tennis balls,
please. And I gotta say, the ball kids at Wimbledon are just incredible. I had the specific memory of this one ball girl who was there, and they'd break out the can and she'd open it up and she'd line up all the cans, and then she was just like a robot, like rolling the cans down to her counterpart down to the base. Like she just had this like machine, and like the ball kids, it's just, they'll run so efficiently. They are on such a tight string, and that's why I'm so glad that they get their moment with the Royals. After the championships, and they all line up and they kind of form that entryway, and the Royals will stop and chat with some of the ball kids, sometimes get into some very detailed conversations. But that whole ball kid operation, machine-like in its efficiency.
Well, we might as well share a little bit of the history of that. The first ball boys, and it was all ball boys until 1977. All girls don't show up to Wimbledon until 1977. In the 20s and 30s, they basically came from orphanages, is what so at the time, the most prestigious tournament in the world was being serviced by charity school children. is sort of one way. From some of them were from very poor families, and it was not frowned upon at the time. I think today it would be not so. It would look like you were taking advantage, because you would be taking advantage of child labor. Now it's a prestigious thing. You get training. They start the training for these ball boys and ball girls, I think, in February. And at this point, there are 250 kids picked out of over thousands of applications.
So one other last number, 114 million pounds, not weight. That's not the weight that's put on from eating all that terrible food. 114 million pounds is in sterling, right? Is that the right term there, Chuck?
I think that's right.
That was the payout for the COVID-19 pandemic insurance, which they had the foresight to apply for and get pandemic insurance in case the event were ever canceled or postponed due to a pandemic.
How about that? That it was the only major sporting event in the world that decided to have pandemic insurance.
Boy, did it pay off.
I mean, literally, you want to talk about surviving, helping them survive and thrive, and obviously make the decision a little bit easier to do, understandably. But that's still, when you think about all of the stuff that we lost during COVID at that period, and look, they were right in the heart of it, right? There was no, right? The Olympics they clearly didn't have pandemic insurance. That's why they went ahead and just bought an extra year and had the Olympics in 21.
Absolutely. So that brings to mind that Wimbledon, they've been prescient, they've been able to adapt, right? And then
in fact, let me throw this at you. Is it because there are times when Wimbledon gets described to be overly traditionalist and rigid. Yet, I think you agree, right? The more they've actually been fairly adaptive, because if they hadn't, they wouldn't be relevant.
And think of how different it is from the point where we started watching it, right? In the late 70s, early 80s, and how much has changed and progressed. And, it's funny. It celebrated its 100th Wimbledon. I think it was 1977. That's how far back it goes. So think to the 1870s when it started, and obviously how much has had to change since that. But we watch because of what hasn't changed.
Yes.
Right. Center court. It's still, this version of center court has been there for as long as we've been watching. We want to see. In fact,
they probably spent too much money trying to retrofit a roof on center court rather than knocking it down and doing something new, because that's how committed they were to keeping that.
It's the most hallowed ground in tennis, right? You cannot alter center court. It survived.
By the way, the original center court, because it did move once, and we'll get into that, is now a field hockey, a girls' field hockey pitch at a local school, which is a fun little fact.
So one thing they abolished, that one thing that has changed is the challenge round. It used to be the defending champion only had to play one match. You got to buy all the way through.
Can you imagine? Djokovic would be, how many titles would he have had, right?
You just extend him, and so that's been gone for over 100 years now. That's again the amazing thing now. Like how long it's been since? So it's been 104 years since they last had
they went 40 years with the challenge round. That wasn't like, oh, that's something we're only going to do for 4 or 5 years. 40 years Wimbledon had the challenge at the challenge round.
The Open era arrived in 1968, and now you had professionals. You actually had the greatest players. So think about, there was a good stretch of time where you didn't have professionals. We'll get into that later. Ladies doubles, mixed doubles became official championship events in 1935, 51 years after the ladies singles. But again, now it's coming up on 100 years since that's been. Everything is like a century when it comes to Wimbledon, or almost a century. Yeah,
pretty much the only major American sporting event that rivals Wimbledon in length is the Kentucky Derby. It's about the only one anyway.
And in some ways, that's changed, or at least the composition, right? The distance is the same. The location is the same. Churchill Ground, the original track is not a field hockey field.
No, it's not a field hockey pitch anymore, right?
But the composition of the jockeys, if you go back and look at the early days, the jockeys were all black. And then, as horse racing kind of, it's a whole other podcast, but
right. Now they're all Latino.
Yeah, you go back and look at who's up on the walls, and they have a museum at Churchill Downs. That's something that's changed a lot.
See, this is why I'm partnered with JA. I live vicariously through you, JA, for every great sporting event. You have there is not a place you haven't been.
I haven't been to the Indianapolis 500. I haven't been to the Indianapolis Speedway. That's on my bucket list. Tiebreak introduced in 1971. Initially resisted. Daily Telegraph's Lance Tingay called it that sequence of abbreviated values, but quickly accepted it as a fan-friendly innovation.
Yeah.
Quick shout out to
feels like the DH, right? It's like everybody complains about it now. No one's going back and going, God, I wish we could let pitchers hit again. Nobody's going, I wish these matches would never end at Wimbledon. It's more fun that way. I don't think that's the way people feel.
So one tradition that I wouldn't mind them bringing back, the mandatory bow and curtsy to the royal box was abolished or abandoned in 2003. I kind of missed that. That was one of the things that made Wimbledon, right? And it was kind of funny. The players wouldn't be sure, like, where do I stop? Do I stop here in curtsy? Do I bow? What do I do?
So here's a hot take for you. If the royal family were more popular around the world and less, shall we say, controversial at times, would they have banned it?
Well, the royal family, I mean, the king and queen.
They love the queen. No, we've always loved the queen. But there's like everything else has been, I don't know. That's just my hot take.
Maybe it's because it's some lesser royals.
Yes.
That tradition I wish they'd bring back. The roof, the retractable roof on Center Court opened in May 2009. And then the number one court roof followed in May 2019. So it's a new number one court, right? They did change that. I kind of missed the old one that had the tower. The cool thing about the number one court, they had some media seats. Actually, your seat was actually below the playing surface, so your head was just barely poking above it. And to me, that was one of my favorite seats in sports. I would love to try to go out there. And one thing, I would sit there and I would sit right on the service line, right?
Yeah,
you can't tell if it's in or out. I'm sorry, these things come in at 110, 120 miles.
What you're saying is the idea that human beings were,
couldn't tell.
As if, and there's no way Mr. McEnroe could know. For sure, when he was yelling at people, right?
Fortunately for Wimbledon, they realized that, and so we've had the Hawkeye line calling technology.
Okay, I'm just going to make one beef. It's my same beef of what we now have in baseball. Some of my favorite memories in baseball and some of my favorite memories in tennis are players yelling at umpires, and now you yell at computers.
Well, to our earlier point that, especially for Americans, tennis is Wimbledon, Wimbledon is tennis. Yep. The most famous John McEnroe outburst of a career filled with them, you cannot be serious, that's at Wimbledon.
I believe he trademarked that line, by the way.
I mean, that's his trademark line, but where did it happen? Why would it mean as much? Would it resonate through all these decades? Would it be his trademark line if it had not occurred at Wimbledon? I say not.
No chance. No chance.
Yeah, yellow tennis balls. We'll end with that one. They replaced the white ones for television purposes. I will say that when Snoopy played at Wimbledon, he used the white tennis balls.
That's good. I kind of miss that. I get that, and I think these days, with everybody having HD TV, that the need for the yellow tennis ball, that TV that you needed sort of in the old standard definition days, I think is less. I wonder if now in the world of HD that it wouldn't feel as television unfriendly.
I like the optic yellow color. I mean, to me, that's a tennis ball color. Is that optic yellow, yellowish, greenish?
Yeah. Someday somebody will explain to me the smell of the tennis ball can. Right, that initial smell. You ever popped a can, right?
First of all, the pop, right? That vacuum seal, that pop,
right? You get the pop, and there's this. It's like sniffing glue. I don't know. It's like some weird you're like, is this gonna get me high or something? What is this smell? It's the vulcanized rubber, but it's still something else.
The blueprint for for Wimbledon.
The All England Club. You hear the phrase a lot when you're watching Wimbledon. Well, guess what? It wasn't. There's a reason they don't say the word tennis in it, because it wasn't founded originally as a tennis club. It was founded as a croquet club. That is already kind of funny, because when you try to explain Wimbledon to the modern sports fans, it's like saying the NBA Finals began as a badminton tournament.
It also gets at the accident of the whole thing, right? So how many things are just a fortunate accident? And Wimbledon was not chosen, the site was not because they thought, oh, this would be a perfect place to put up a cathedral for tennis.
Right.
You know, the club was already there. There was a meadow. There was a railway, conveniently enough. There was enough land, and there was a sport that needed grass, because that's how tennis was played at the time. So it's that railway, the accident place. I really like the fact that Wimbledon is a destination. When you take the tube train to go out to the All England Club, the train says Wimbledon on it. You know, like you're going to Wimbledon, destination Wimbledon. So it just kind of helps build the excitement on your journey out there.
Is that the best way to go? Is on the tube, is public transportation?
Absolutely, yeah. You can take the you can it's kind of expensive from the center of town to take but you're riding one of those cool black London taxi cabs, right? So that is a cool way to go. I think there was a media shuttle out there.
Give a sense, like where, like, you know, is it, would you call it a suburb of London, or it is part of London?
It's Southwest 19? Is that the designation? I think that's it. But yeah, it's a part of London. It's like the arrondissements in Paris. I think it's like a segment of London. It's an area, neighbor. It's more of a neighborhood, I would say, than. Well, you know what, though, Chuck? From journalistic perspective, it gets a separate date line. So technically, if you file from Wimbledon, the date line, when I filed from the Washington Post, it was Dateline Wimbledon. So I guess it's its own entity in that regard.
Look, it was not even called tennis at first. It was called something called Schwersticky, which just feels like a made-up word. And if I even showed you how it's spelled, you'd be like, what the heck is this? It got shortened to sticky. And it was kind of, you're just like, wait, what are you talking about? Here's a sport that now has billions of dollars, global icons. The most important tournament on earth was once marketed as a sticky tournament.
It sounds icky, not just sticky, right? That sounds like a rejected British candy. Speaking of candy in the trains, like I always like the fact that in the tube stations they have like Cadbury machines like right on the platform. So you're waiting for your train, you can get a Cadbury or something. There's the technology that helped advance, and for something that seems so ancient and old, it is a story of technology, right?
It doesn't happen. I mean, where would we be without the lawnmower?
Right,
with grass courts at Wimbledon.
Rubber, right? And kind of the dawn of the industrial age. You needed all these things.
Right. I mean, this is, it's funny. Wimbledon feels, it feels old world. It feels like a before time. One of the things we think we love about it is that it's this, we're going back to a different era. But the irony is, without the Industrial Revolution, there is no tennis, right? Because you needed a lawnmower. You needed vulcanized rubber so the ball could actually bounce. That is something that doesn't get invented till Mr. Goodyear. You need a court that can be marked and replicated. So it really was actually a sport that the new technology of the 19th century allowed it to happen.
And kind of the regularity that came along with the industrial age, right? And you might say conformity too, but also the fact that, you did have precise measurements for the court that would be replicated everywhere. Baseball, which is getting started around that same time, you could have different outfield wall distances, right? And some of the walls and some of the ballparks were irregular. Like maybe the diamond and the bases and the infield and the pitcher's mound to the home plate was the same, but you did have some irregularity in the outfield. Whereas in tennis, the entire playing surface had to be conformed to these strict measurements.
So they decide they needed a new lawnmower, so they hold, literally, it's a fundraiser for the first championship. The first championship meeting to raise money for this roller. So the first one had been donated. It wasn't working. So they were organized to pay for this lawnmower. What's interesting is this, originally they call it a pony roller. So before you had a mechanical lawnmower, this makes sense. You basically had a lawnmower literally pulled by horses that was trimming the grass. Very Victorian.
I mean, at least they didn't have goats come and chew up the grass, right? It's it's a little more sophisticated than that.
So the first champion is won by a gentleman named Spencer Gore, and he is a big. It's 22 men were invited. No women were allowed yet. By the way, there was no photography at the first championships. A local newspaper sent a sketch artist, J.A.
Like a courtroom?
Yeah. So, and which, by the way, only adds to the old world feeling, right? That the first championships, we have no photographic image of it. You have to go and use it. It's a sketch artist, which I think that's kind of charming.
That's part of the romanticism, though. Like when I went to Wimbledon first time, I bought a poster, and it was very much Victorian. I remember there was a woman in kind of a Victorian era dress. Like, it was very old fashioned, like it's funny. I bought two things. I bought, one was like an overhead photo of center court. And then I bought this poster, this artistic poster that sort of captured the Victorian era images of Wimbledon in a painting.
So the first guy that wins is this guy, Spencer Gore. And Gore is not just some guy who just wandered in. He was a rackets player. And I'll give you a quick explanation. What did that mean back then, rackets? So rackets is essentially it was an older indoor racket sport, kind of an ancestor to squash. Like, it was indoor, yeah. It was played in an enclosed court. There was a hard ball that moved fast. So it was very much more squash / racquetball than anything else. Gore also played real tennis, the older indoor game from which tennis gets its scoring system from. But when he played lawn tennis, this is this idea of an outdoor tennis match, right? That was what was new. When he does this lawn tennis court, he is not thinking like he was going to play the way Wimbledon ended up being played for so long, as sort of a baseline deal. He just started to attack the net, and he used the net. And in fact, he was so effective at it, they quickly changed some rules because of how he won that first game. And it was just because he was playing like he was essentially, a much faster version of the game than the other players understood the game to be played.
Well, he understood the surface, right? So we saw how the serve and volleyers were so effective at Wimbledon years later, decades later, a century later, but he was ahead of the game in that regard. So I think it's cool that Wimbledon, it does give tennis its court, its premier championship, this public stage, the rituals, and creates the mythology around it too.
It is. I mean, it is sort of funny, though, that, again, that literally, I guess you could say the peach baskets to basketball is the lawnmower to tennis.
I'll go with that.
We go with that.
And sometimes it's the circumstances of the place. Why is the basketball hoop 10 feet to this day in fastball around the world? Because, well, that was basically the height of the track that ran around the indoor gym in Springfield, Massachusetts, at the particular gym where Dr. James Naismith hung up the peach baskets. It happened to be 10 feet above the floor. And so that's the measurement that we have today. Some people think you should raise it to take the dunk out of the game, but I'm good with 10 feet. I'm good with keeping it the way it was at the YMCA in Springfield, Mass. So, there's some things that were particular, I think, to that time and place, specifically in Wimbledon, in the 19th century, that endure to this day.
I guess I go back, and it's going to be a question that will be recurring in here. Is how much, I go back, without Wimbledon, would tennis just be racquetball or squash or lacrosse in this country?
And if you don't think it could go away, Think of how popular racquetball was in the 80s. It's funny. I'm here on campus at Northwestern when our sports facility, it opened in the 1980s in the kind of the peak of the tennis era. So we had racquetball era. So we had like 8 racquetball courts in there, which have since most of them have been repurposed for other uses. But at the time it was designed, like you think of the movies like Splash, and it seemed like every major movie in the 80s, there'd be like a racquetball scene, right? I think there's one in like Wall Street. So like,
You're right.
So that was a big racket sport that went away. And I guess the precursor, right? If you're telling me tennis started as an indoor sport. So things can come and go to a wide degree. I don't know anyone that plays racquetball anymore, but tennis still endures, and tennis remains very popular to this day.
Racquetball had enough popularity that you had outdoor racquetball courts, remember? Like you had public parks that actually would have like those concrete that were sort of, you could use it for racquetball or squash, but it was like those outdoor walls essentially.
You wonder, Chuck, if racquetball would have had a Wimbledon, if it would have had this cathedral, maybe it survived. So we definitely have to give Wimbledon some credit for the creation and the popularizing of tennis, but the endurance of tennis and the reason it never went away, because you had this central focal point, this Vatican, that was a shrine to the sport itself.
Well, and that takes us to sort of the next chapter of how we want to cover this a little bit, is sort of how did Wimbledon become an event? And it is, and over the sort of, it starts to get a little bit of traction. Literally the very first tournament, they get to charge money, and there are people waiting to see it, and it slowly starts to become an event. And then it starts to, who gets the best seat, and how do you make sure that the stars are there at the end? And what do the players wear? What does the crowd expect? And this is sort of the next 30 years of this tournament, sort of between 1880 and say 1920, is sort of how the tournament goes from its infancy, I guess is the way to put it, to the beginning of a spectacle.
And if it's not leading the way necessarily, it's certainly keeping up with the times, right? Because as we get into the 20s and the 30s, sport is becoming mass entertainment. It's helped by radio, right? So the live broadcasts of the games. And then, of course, in a couple decades after that, television is so huge to it. The Olympic movement is growing. You have Olympics in LA and in Berlin, and those are big deals. The World Cup, as we record this, we're in the midst of World Cup fever here in the summer of 2026. The World Cup starts in 1930. Heavyweight boxing is pulling huge crowds. Wembley, and the FA Cup are a part of British culture. Baseball, you've got Babe Ruth and the 1927 Yankees and the mythology of that. The mythology of Notre Dame football, Grantland Rice and the Four Horsemen, college football as Newt Rockney, all of that stuff is going on. So this is all going around. This is the sporting world at large, and Wimbledon is able to keep up with that, Chuck. And how did they do it?
Well, look, early Wimbledon, we talked about this before, had the strange format, one of the stranger formats in major sports, the challenge round. Although where the defending champion did not have to play through the draw, everyone else fought through the tournament, and then the survivor got to challenge the champion.
So they're like the final boss in a video game.
Yeah. Remember that? And when we were kids, it'd be like, no. I'm the guy you got to play at the end. Wasn't the early NCAA basketball tournament had some form of this, where you certainly got a lot of, if you were a high ranked team or a defending champ, you got a lot more deference.
I will say, just to speak to, you bring up the NCAA tournament, and just to kind of speak to the importance of Wimbledon and how intrinsically tied it is to the sport. So the NCAA tournament, March Madness, has become college basketball, but it wasn't foundational to college basketball the way Wimbledon was to tennis. In fact, for decades, the NIT, the National Invitation Tournament, was a bigger deal, and that was the winner of that was really considered the national champion. So I'd say you get really till the late 50s or the 60s when the NCAA starts to take over. So another way in which Wimbledon stands apart from some of its peers on the sporting calendar is that it's more intrinsic to the foundation of the sport than things such as the NCAA tournament and the Final Four.
Basically, and this is the argument I sort of keep leaning into, is it's almost like the tournament, and it made the sport rather than the sport inventing the tournament. At the end of the day, basketball still invented the NCAA tournament, right? Basketball was there, where it's not like the tournament itself kind of like either invents or sort of the game. So the challenge round lasts till 1922. Yeah,
but you know what Wimbledon invented that is such a huge part of the NCAA tournament?
Yeah.
Brackets and seeding, right? And the notion that, let's rank the entrants into this contest.
Well, and that's what's amazing, because guess what they were worried about? They weren't worried about the integrity of this sport. They were worried about creating the best entertainment value for the spectators. That's why they created seeding in 1927. Because if they had not had seeding, before they had seeding, the two best players might meet in the first round, and then all of a sudden you end up with some weird, which maybe sports freaks like you and I like the underdog story and you want, but it would, imagine if the Williams sisters played in round one. And you're like, well, all right, what if they're the two best in the tournament? Well, that stinks, and I have to tell you that you're right. Like, it's not just what would tennis be without seeding? What would the NCAA tournament be without seeding? Like, it is an important change in just how putting the entertainment into sport.
Yeah, and it's crowd management, it's storytelling. And it's funny because the NCAA didn't even realize, even though it had seeding for a long time, it wasn't until CBS took over the broadcast package in the early 80s that they made Selection Sunday a thing. They decided, hey, let's televise the announcement of the brackets. And so not just who gets in and out, right, and who gets snubbed, but who gets the top seeds and what the brackets look like and what the regions and which regions might be tougher than others, and what the seeding looks like. So again, the NCAA tournament was really late to understanding the value of these things, and the seeding of Wimbledon. And what's cool about Wimbledon, which helps make it distinctive to this day, is that they don't necessarily adhere to the rankings, right? They'll take into consideration
they do their own seeding
perform on grass, right?
Yeah.
We'll do our own seeding based on maybe how people have performed here at Wimbledon in the past, or if this person is better on grass than that person. So, it's drama, but it's also they preserve their own autonomy, shall we say?
Look, they want the best matches on the final weekend, pure and simple, and so of course they're going to take that into account. And that to me is, look, that is one thing, as quote as old and traditional as Wimbledon was in some ways. I mean, talk about they're further ahead of college football. It took college football over 100 years to figure out how to get its best teams to play, right?
And how to figure out the seed, right? And they're still tinkering with how you rank and right. It's funny though, going back to the seeds and Wimbledon. So in 95, the tournament, it just so happened that the top four seeds made the semifinals in both the men's and the women's brackets. And the Wimbledonians were very proud of themselves. The All England Club, they had the self-congratulatory.
Was there a perfect bracket for them? It was their version of a perfect bracket.
Bracket. They got it right. We had our top four seeds. Actually, though, it's funny because I don't think the top two seeds met in the finals. I think there was an upset there in the semis, but they did have the top four, so they got their brackets right, and they were very proud of themselves. They put out a press release.
Look, and I want to before we go into the sort of the first superstars in the history of Wimbledon, I want to sort of go down this quick rabbit hole, which goes to the underdog versus the dynasty, and what is it? We always say we love a good underdog story, but like I realize this Goran Ivanovic, which is, he's still one of the most remarkable Wimbledon champions ever. Comes in as a wild card, basically wins out of nowhere, never wins another major and all this stuff. And I had to be reminded of his name, right? Like, what is the better sports story for history's sake versus what is the better sports story for J.A. Adande on deadline?
On deadline, give me, well, I want the big dogs there in the Final Fours. So
Mhm.
I'm just kind of surprised how much NCAA tournament we're talking here, but it does seem to fit in parallel. So yeah, you want some upsets on the first few weekends, especially when the seeding disparity is so great. 15
Mhm.
beating a 2 is a big deal, right? But America has shown it does not want underdogs playing in April, right? So I would say
Right.
March Madness, April assuredness, because
Yes.
we had it a couple years ago with some seemingly random
Florida
school,
Atlantic. Look, it was
Florida Atlantic,
my
your
hometown
backyard.
school. University of Miami made that Final Four. It was like
San
UConn.
Diego State, I think, was
Yeah,
out there, right?
you had two
So like
non-majors. Yeah,
you didn't have the blue bloods, and what happened to the ratings? They tanked,
it
right? I'm
collapsed.
sorry, you might hate Duke, but you're going to
Right.
watch Duke, right? And you're going to watch those name brand schools, and especially in college basketball where the players turn over so much, you need
Right.
that familiarity. You need to know the school and the uniform and the fight song. You need those blue bloods there. And I
And it's
think the
just
same applies for tennis too. Like you wanted to see Borg and McEnroe in the finals, right? You didn't want to see
100%.
some upstart there. Now it was a big deal, say when Boris Becker, as a 17-year-old, breaks through, but you couldn't have a new Boris Becker every year. A, the novelty would wear off, and
Right.
B, you need those name brand people there to drive the television ratings, which, as we'll get into, becomes an important part of the Wimbledon story.
So the first true superstar era actually is in the 1880s, and it's the Renshaw twins, William and Ernest. They basically show that tennis can be athletic. They use what is then a unique thing, the overhead serve. Well, you could just imagine that they first started with the very gentleman underhand serve, right? By the way, I still have visions of Michael Chang in the French Open when he had that shoulder issue, right, doing the underhand serve. But so they turned what had been basically a very genteel baseline game, almost more like badminton going across, right, into something that was faster, more explosive, frankly, more spectator friendly.
But at least then with the equipment, you can still have long rallies. So it's interesting to think of the changes. So by the 90s, you've got modern equipment, right?
Sure.
And like graphite tennis rackets, and the string is tight. It's not literally like catgut for the strings, right? You got the high tension nylon strings. Yeah. And so, they're hitting the ball with so much power and force, and it's coming off the racket with such high velocity that it's harder to get long rallies. So, that we talked about the technological influence at the beginning, so it might maybe help create the game, but there were some that would argue that the technology was taking over and ruining the game, and just making it just 1-2 points, and that was it, killing the long rallies.
I know. I've always dreamed of, like, can we hand? I'd like to see, like, okay, we're gonna give you these rackets from the 1950s to like Nadal and Federer,
old wooden rackets.
And let's see how you do, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The head is like like the size of my head, not these gigantic.
Right. They're very small, right?
Right. Meanwhile, on the women's side, Charlotte Cooper is showing that going back to the 1880s, the women's tennis can have a dominant champion. Suzanne Lenglen turns it into celebrity too. She's got clothes, she's got charisma. Sipping brandy in between sets.
How about that? All right. I mean, I guess that's a little bit of painkiller, right? You can rub some Bengay or you take a shot of brandy, right?
Long before Gatorade, have some brandy.
The original center court, actually, where Lenglen won her first title, still exists. It's the school hockey pitch I was telling you about on that front, and it means that old Wimbledon still technically exists if you want to go find it and visit it.
Now it's over on Church Road, I believe, is the address. But it does feel layered. It's not just old because Wimbledon says it's old. You can find the old versions of it underneath the current versions, right? There's echoes. So the Williams sisters, they weren't the first sisters to meet in the late rounds of Wimbledon.
No, I mean, it's funny with Wimbledon, as sort of frankly behind the times they were for so long when it came to equal prize money for women. A women's title was, the first women's tournament was in 1884, only 7 years after the men. Only 10 women entered. The first women's champion And you just alluded to it, Maud Watson. She beat her own sister in the final. So when we talk about Venus and Serena, and it's such a frankly definitional time for women's tennis in general in the early 21st century. In the late 19th century, it is sisters launching Wimbledon. How about that?
Amazing. Yeah. So, we also have to think about what they were playing in, right? Mm-hmm. This is the Victorian era, so they're playing.
They're playing in corsets. It's crazy.
Hats, they're wearing hats. And this is the dawn of the all-white dress code.
It is sort of, and the whole idea of the clothing as sort of, and you can't talk about Wimbledon without talking about clothing, right? Because it wasn't a side issue. It is arguably one of the main characters of the story of Wimbledon. With the corsets and the petticoats, it was clothing designed to preserve modesty, not to show women actually sweating. There was just, the sweat was going to be in the undergarments. They weren't there to show off athletic prowess. They were there to preserve their modesty.
Yeah, and it shows the constraints the women were under in that era, right? So you can compete, but there's still all these societal norms of social expectations in that era that you're expected to conform to.
But look, like everything that we're going to tell you in the story of Wimbledon, they're basically, every change started with a protest, right? These little rebellions. So on the clothes front, you had a young lady at 15 named Lottie Dodd. She plays in something closer to her school uniform at the time, which meant no corset, and she wins. Mae Sutton rolled up her sleeves because she was hot. She showed her arms.
People were aghast.
I know, right? But it is exactly what allowed this to sort of change, right? So, the clothing story at Wimbledon really just starts, as a social expectation before it becomes a written rule. And for decades, the all-white look, it was not formal code. It wasn't like there was a sign, no shoes, no shirts, no service, no all whites, you're not playing. It was just, this is what you did. But of course, one of the things I've learned a lot, especially in my world of politics, J.A., is that norms are meaningless unless you actually make them laws. And Wimbledon finally decided to make it a law.
Although the rule doesn't have to be written down if you understand and everyone knows, who this room is built for, right? And there was sort of these expectations and these implementations that were such a big part of it.
But look, for this is another through line in the history of Wimbledon, is that particularly on the women's side of the women's side of the ledger here, it was constant rebellions in order to sort of equalize things. The Victorian women are in corsets and petticoats, and Lenglen shortens the skirts. She changes how women can move. Bunny Austin wears shorts for the first time on center court. Gussie Moran shows up in 1949 in a fashionable outfit designed by then a huge fashion designer named Ted Tinling, and it revealed lace-trimmed underwear. Think about that in 1949. She shows up on the courts in 1949, and you can see the lace-trimmed underwear, and it causes a huge scandal. And it actually is one of the reasons why by 1963, they actually write down the rule, and it's the phrase predominantly white. And let's just say the word predominantly does a lot of work here because there's a lot of fights over the years that go all the way to Rafael Nadal on what meets the definition of predominantly white in the clothes that you're wearing.
And of course, this was all a precursor to Ann White showing up in the mid-1980s, and it was white, but it was, this one single piece, head to toe, like whatever the material was, whatever it was tight, lycra or neoprene, whatever it was, super tight, this all white head to toe leggings, one piece outfit that just clung to her. And they
didn't like that.
No, that did not go well. There was not a repeat appearance of the Ann White, super tight one leotard.
The irony is that what would happen is, so they write down the rule, and then more players wanted to rebel. And then literally we go into the 90s now, and you get Andre Agassi. He literally boycotted Wimbledon for 3 years because of the dress code. And, look, Agassi was, All you had to do was see your Canon ad campaigns to know, right? Agassi was loud. He was bright colors. This was not a guy that wanted to just wear all white. So he boycotts Wimbledon and finally comes back, and there's this big tension. What's he going to be wearing? And he shows up in a tracksuit, and he unzips very slowly, sort of eats the moment up a little bit, and he reveals his all white outfit. He surrendered.
Very dramatic. But he was always the showman, ever the show. Even when he was conforming, it was still making a show out of it. Before we go on too far, let's talk about Charlotte Cooper, who later became Charlotte Sterry. She's one of those champions that gets swallowed by history. She won Wimbledon 5 times. She was a dominant women's player of the Victorian era. She also becomes the first Olympic gold medalist in women's tennis, an individual sport, in 1900 at the Paris Olympics.
So had they had more Grand Slams, she might have been the first. She might have come before Steffi Graf as the first Golden Slam winner, with getting a gold medal in tennis as well.
Yeah, she was that dominant, and then Lenglen comes along, and greatness becomes a celebrity. So we talk about Agassi certainly as the showman, but just the celebrity aspect of women's tennis. And
that's, Suzanne Lenglen, this was an interesting person to learn about in our research, because she really is, you can see this, and this, again, it matches the era, right? In the 30s and 40s, you started to have more and more of sort of, frankly, we were just becoming more enamored with celebrity around the world, right? And she helped create a celebrity fact, sort of the celebrity buzz at Wimbledon. She's French, so that automatically meant people assumed she was glamorous. So she was dominant. She was sort of stereotypical French, right? She was dramatic. She wears clothes that scandalize, right? She drank brandy at courtside. And she was pretty good at tennis as well.
But she's also the first tennis player who feels like the modern sports celebrity.
And she was good for Wimbledon, because again, one thing Wimbledon always realized is they wanted to be a spectacle. And boy, she turned Wimbledon and arguably sort of made it the society event that it is today.
It becomes glamorous and dangerous. You always want that little element of danger. She's not just winning. She's performing. She's wearing these shorter skirts. She's changing how women move on the court. And she's drinking that brandy too.
I mean, did Gatorade miss the boat here?
Well, I mean, think about it. Coca-Cola featured cocaine, right? It was the key element in Coca-Cola, and it was kind of originally branded as like a energy type drink, right? What Red Bull became.
Was. Yeah, it gives you energy. That's the word on the street.
Lift, right? So, if you can have cocaine in a refreshment, a soft drink, right? You can certainly have alcohol in a sports drink.
I'm thinking about Nadal and sports drink. Nadal and Federer, and they're like just and if you're sitting there and you grab a shot of brandy, I just don't know how that's going to work.
Or the cocaine infused Coca-Cola. I'd imagine Federer coked out on center court.
Well, we should talk about the move, even though we've talked about it. It was in 1922 that Wimbledon moved from Warple Road to Church Road, and that is still where it resides. King George V opened the new grounds. He didn't make a speech. He just sounded a gong.
A gong? That doesn't sound very regal and dignified.
I know. I mean, it was
the Gong Show in the 1970s.
That's what I think. I mean,
Chuck Barris.
It feels very Eastern, right? Like that's something you might have expected in China or in the in the Far East back in the day. A gong, but that's Wimbledon, right? Formal and weird at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The new center court, by the way, is still called center court, even though so the good news is center court got its name the correct way in the old Wimbledon grounds. It was literally the court in the center of the grounds. But it was so important that even though center court, right, you've been there, right? It is actually at the end, at the far end of the grounds of Wimbledon now. But there was, how do you change the name?
maybe since I've been there, it's changed. It felt very much in the center when I was there, especially when I first went in. You'd go in, you go past um, the Perry statue, and it's still, if not at the exact geographic center of Wimbledon, it still very much is at the heart of Wimbledon. We'll say that.
This next fun little development is something that I know you would appreciate as a sports writer, because once again, one of the great phrases in sports history was created by a sports writer. This is the era where tennis gets its most important phrase, Grand Slam. And the origin story of using the phrase Grand Slam to describe winning the 4 major tournaments was a sports writer who was deciding to borrow a phrase from the card game bridge.
Bridge? Like what my grandmother played?
Hey, man. I had a grandfather who forced me to learn bridge because he always needed a fourth. So, yes, your grandmother and me, are the 2 bridge players,
You guys are along great.
Yeah, it was 1933. Jack Crawford is trying to win all 4 majors. He didn't win. He actually didn't do it. The first person to do it was a guy named Don Budge. Is the first person to actually do the Grand Slam in 1938. But the phrase stuck in 1933 that he was trying to get the Grand Slam. And, this is how sports mythology gets made. And you and I were talking the other day about this, and you were sort of lamenting that, this has been the norm for sports for 100 years, is that it's the sports journalists who sort of create the iconic nicknames or naming conventions that stick and become fan favorites.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, right? The 4 Horsemen, Grantland Rice, maybe among the most famous nicknames bestowed, but all the way through the 70s, as a sports writer in East Lansing, they came up with the nickname Magic for Irvin Johnson, one of the all-time great nicknames. The Gas House Gang, Murderers Row, all these great nicknames that were bestowed by sports writers, and we have fallen off. And we've become derelict in that duty and that noble aspect of the sport. And I'll take some blame because it happened on my watch too, right? I'm not going to say I'm solely responsible, but I didn't do enough to prevent it. I tried to go with the Quiet Storm for Tim Duncan, borrowing from that late night radio format.
He needed a good nickname. Yeah. What did he end up with one?
He never did, and Timmy, that was his nickname. It was, that's what. So we've fallen upon like nicknames or abbreviations or initials, right? So like KD for Kevin Durant, and they tried the Slim Reaper, which would have been a great one, but he didn't like it that much. We just don't have great nicknames anymore, like the Iceman for George Gervin, just an all-time great nickname. And again, I've tried here and there, I couldn't get it done, but we've just collectively as an industry lost the ability to bestow these great nicknames. But I never knew until you brought it up that Grand Slam was another that goes in the pantheon of great sports.
It really does.
I guess it's not a nickname because it's not specific to anyone, but a moniker or terminology.
And it is so now you hear the word Grand Slam, it's sort of like, it's one of my favorite, the movie Groundhog Day, right? Groundhog Day, the actual definition of Groundhog Day is completely changed because of the movie. The actual definition of Grand Slam has its origin is bridge, and yet for 90% of the American public, if you say Grand Slam, they immediately would assume one of 3 things: clearing the home run that clears with bases loaded home run, or a golf or tennis tournament.
Right.
They would not. I promise you. Bridge, and by the way, in case you're wondering what the Grand Slam is in bridge, it's when you win all 13 tricks. And again,
so it's not 4?
But it's not 4. That's the, everybody gets their 13 cards in bridge.
But wasn't it tied to like the 4 positions on the bridge table? Something?
Well, it was always 4, right? In that you won everybody's cards, right? You won all 4 positions, right? You won every trick type of thing. Yes, that in that sense. Yes. So I guess you could say there's 4. And that is the one common denominator, obviously, between clearing the bases or winning your 4 golf tournaments or winning your 4 tennis tournaments.
So someone, I don't know if it was a sports writer or not, and by 1930, coins the term Wimbledonia, which is a perfect, it's kind of all encompassing, right? Because Wimbledon is no longer just a tournament. Becomes its own little country, right? During the fortnight. It's got its own geography, Southwest 19, dress code, class system, the food, its own rules. The weather becomes a part of the story. And then radio and TV begin turning that little country into something that the world can visit.
And I think that's where we're going to go to next, because as Wimbledon becomes a cathedral for the world of tennis, this is when the players rise up, and the next iteration of Wimbledon is sort of the players take over, which is what we're going to dive into when we come back. So by this point, J.A., Wimbledon has become the cathedral. It has the grass, the clothes, the royal box, the center court, the rituals, the sense that this is not just a tennis tournament, but this is a place where tennis itself explains what it is. This is a cathedral, but every cathedral has gates. And for a long time, the Wimbledon story was about who those gates were built for and who had to fight their way through the gates.
And this is where the story gets a little complicated, because Wimbledon is easy to romanticize, and a lot of the romance is real. The grass is real, and the history is real. The players their feelings that they have when they're walking on the center court, that's real too. But old institutions don't just preserve beauty, they preserve the power, they preserve the institution, right? And so this act to me is about the players gradually forcing Wimbledon to become worthy of its own mythology. Professionals and the women and the Black players, they all force it. The players' associations force it too. This is when Wimbledon becomes more than just a private club with a famous tournament. It becomes the world stage for tennis.
So let's start with class, because there's been, you want to talk about the divides. Class was the first great divide here before anything else. This is Britain, right? So class is never very far away. A gentleman by the name of Fred Perry wins Wimbledon 3 straight years in the 1930s. He is the greatest champion in the UK. He's British. He is the guy Andy Murray has spent 77 years chasing, historically speaking.
There's a statue of him at the All England Club.
There you go. But Perry is not, at the time, the establishment's idea of their tennis champion, because he's the son of a Labour member of Parliament, the working class Labour Party of the day. He's not from the correct background, J.A.
And that's what's so revealing, because he wins the tournament, but he still doesn't fully belong to the club.
In fact, so he wins his first Wimbledon. And the tradition then was you got a tie. You got the member tie, because if you won, you became a member. Well, he did not get the traditional member tie presented to him personally. It was left on a bench near his clothes.
That's such a British insult.
Quiet, polite, dismissive, and devastating, right?
So the message is, you can win here, but that doesn't mean you are one of us. And that's an important distinction, because we're going to see it again. Wimbledon, it can recognize greatness before it fully accepts the person who produced it.
By the way, this happened to John McEnroe. So the tradition, once you win Wimbledon, you become a member. They didn't give him his honorary membership for a year. It was basically their way of saying, we didn't love your behavior. And
well, the fans didn't greet him openly too. The first time he steps right as he's stepping on the center court for the first championship match against Borg, they're booing him. Very un-Wimbledon-like, un-British-like response to boo someone just as he sets foot on the grass.
Now, other than the pandemic in 2020, the only other time Wimbledon did not have a tournament was, you won't be surprised, World War II, where during World War II, literally center court was bombed. So the war comes and the cathedral itself almost disappears. So there's no tournaments from 1940 to 1945. A bomb actually falls through center court in its roof, destroys about 1,200 seats. 16 bombs altogether fall on club property, and the grounds become something else entirely. The car parks became vegetable plots, right? It was all about doing whatever it took to help with the war. Animals were being kept on the grounds. Military units were drilling on the concourse.
I mean, that's the thing with these, sporting events. It's great expanses of land, which
That's
comes
right.
in really handy during the war, but it has to be repurposed, right? So center court goes from a place where champions are crowned to it's a part farm, it's a
Yeah.
military space, and it's also a bombed out symbol of survival.
And there's one person who holds the whole club together, constantly worrying about it, and holds it together administratively. Her name is Nora Gordon Cleather. She, at the time, was the acting secretary during the war. But boy, she's actually an unsung hero to Wimbledon.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that institutions don't survive just through their own weight, right? There has to be somebody who does the work. And as inevitable as Wimbledon feels now, at that moment, it wasn't inevitable, right? It was on life support and it had to be sustained. And there's also legacy from the Warriors that becomes kind of a positive, charming part of the Wimbledon tradition. And that's 500 men and women from the British Armed Forces will take 15 days off out of their allotted 30 per year. And they'll volunteer as stewards as Wimbledon. And that's something that started in 1946 as a way to reward the soldiers from World War II. Now being rewarded by volunteering for work, but what it did do was it got you inside that hallowed ground, and so you got to be a part of the tournament. You got to be on those grounds, and so that's something that continued. But it had its origins from post-war Britain.
I don't think we can underscore enough how important Wimbledon is to the British, right? It is an identity for them that is. I'm trying to think of what the American equivalent would be. 50 years ago, you'd have said the World Series. I guess you'd say the Super Bowl, but it's like, but I don't know if an iconic venue. I'm trying to think, is there even a venue that has maybe Madison Square Garden, right? That has the same
but it's
hold
still
over
not
the Brits.
part of the national identity. And, a point of pride. Maybe Augusta National Golf Course, but it's still, if you think about.
We're going to get into the Masters comparison in a little bit. Yeah.
There's a 2-century fall from grace of the British Empire, right? Which maybe you could argue continued all the way through handing over Hong Kong.
One could argue it's still happening now. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
but
not to get into too much politics.
Yeah. But one thing that never fell off for the Brits was Wimbledon. And no other tournament. It's not like the U.S. Open has surpassed it or the Australian Open. Like Wimbledon is still the monarch above all else. And so for, a place that has clung to the monarchy, but not just the monarchy, that idea of, rule Britannia, for Wimbledon to still rule over all else, I think matters to the national psyche.
I will. So I got to go to Roland Garros a couple years ago, and I've not been to Wimbledon yet. I can't wait to do the comparison. Have you done both, Roland Garros?
I have. I went to Roland Garros for the first time in a couple years. So
I have to say, Roland Garros really blew me away. It feels like no other it didn't feel like any venue that I'd been to in the United States. Put it that way.
Well, actually, my favorite part, and this is not the negative, like the egress, when you leave, you're walking through this park. It's the most beautiful exit to a sporting venue I've ever seen. But it's funny, you call it Roland Garros, but I think to most of us, we think of it as the French Open, and the venue is certainly Roland Garros. But they like the whole thing to be called Roland. They like to say like Rafael Nadal.
It's more of like an entity,
Roland Garros.
Yes.
Right. Like the merchandise that I bought, it doesn't say French Open, it says Roland Garros. Yeah. Roland Garros is that hasn't flown, so to speak. It never took off. And I say that as a pun because Roland Garros was an aviator, and that the area, the ground is named after him. But again, Wimbledon is not actually the name of the tournament, but we all collectively know it as Wimbledon. The French would like us to call the tournament Roland Garros, but we all call it the French Open. So they haven't been successful. That's one way. So that eternal French-British rivalry, that's one way where the British have won that round because they want you to call it Wimbledon. They think of it as Wimbledon. We all call it Wimbledon. The French would love for you to call it Roland Garros, but we call it the French Open. But the grounds are Roland Garros, and I don't know, it's not as overwhelming to me. It's not as impressive to me as Wimbledon. Wimbledon, when you walk out of the grounds, what struck me, it's so green. Everything, the paint is green.
Right time of year.
The first
time of year for the green too, though, right?
Grass is so green, and then the posts are this, shiny wooden posts. Yeah. Everything is just vibrant. Of course, by the end, the grass gets worn down, and it's this sort of dull brown, especially right down the middle where most of the action is. But I don't know. Physically, Wimbledon, the site, the All England Club, is more just on site. It's more impressive to me than the French. The French Open and Roland Garros grounds are very pleasant, and like I said, exiting it is just
it's very
this
pleasant,
beautiful sight when you're leaving. But it ain't Wimbledon. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think.
All right, so,
you like the Roland Garros, you will love Wimbledon.
I can't wait.
All right, so if we're talking about players forcing the gates open, talking about gates and entrances and exits, the biggest hypocrisy in tennis for decades was amateurism, right? On paper, amateurism sounds noble, it sounds pure. You play for the love of the sport, you don't play for money. But in practice,
your little British accent there. All right. Yeah.
I couldn't help but slip into it.
Yeah.
But it's actually very classist because it's about protecting sports for people who can afford to play for love of the game. And that's not all. It's certainly not the working class.
Sure, if you have money, amateurism is romantic. But if you need to earn a living, it's frankly a barrier.
So tennis becomes full of what these people call shamateurism. It's the fake amateurism. There's under-the-table payments. There's expenses paid. There's appearance money. All these arrangements that everyone knows are happening, but nobody really wants to admit it. So the official story is still purity, but the real story is about control.
We should talk about probably the most absurd example is Rod Laver, right? He's arguably the best player in the world at the time, at the peak of his powers. And he gets banned from Wimbledon for 5 years because he made the decision that he wanted to make a couple of bucks. He turns professional. I know. How dare he?
But what it means is that the most prestigious tournament in tennis in the world is conducting these tournaments without the best tennis player in the world. And, this is when the institution's logic starts to collapse, because if Wimbledon is supposed to be the ultimate test of tennis, but the best players can't enter it, then what exactly are we watching?
This next story is one of my favorite. Pauline Betts. This story is amazing.
Yeah, and it shows how absurd the system can get, because she wins Wimbledon in 1946, and it's the first championships after the war, and then she's banned from amateur tennis. Not because she turned professional, and it's not because she signed a contract, not because she took money, it's because she said she was considering taking money for playing.
That reminds me of us back when, remember, college players would be ineligible for simply having lunch with an agent?
Yeah.
You were caught hanging out with an agent, and that was it. Banned. You couldn't do it.
Also reminds me of one of my apocryphal. I never was able to find out who actually said this or if it was actually said, but this basketball coach goes to an official and says, can you give me a technical for what I think? Rep says no. He says, well, I think you're doing a horseshit job.
I love that. That's fantastic. I'm sorry. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that over and over. What a great. Can I get in trouble for what I'm thinking? No. Well, I think you're an SOB.
Terrible. So in this case, it was a thought crime, just like that rep calling the tech. And it tells you the whole system wasn't really about purity. It was about the governing bodies keeping control over the players.
Yeah, and that's a pretty, that's probably the negative legacy at times of Wimbledon. Now, look, the turning point actually becomes a bit comical. So in 1967, Wimbledon realizes, hey, people want to see the best tennis players. So they decide to host a professional tournament on center court featuring the very players who had been banned from the championships. Rod Laver, Ken Rosewall, Pancho Gonzalez at the time.
It's kind of funny because it's the opposite. At Augusta, they hosted an amateur tournament as something new and different to get more exposure. But here they get the pros. Wimbledon puts the forbidden players on its own court, and everyone can see clearly these guys are better.
So the institution accidentally exposes its own hypocrisy, right?
And sometimes that's how change happens in sports, right? It's not because the people in charge suddenly become enlightened, but because the contradiction becomes too obvious to defend. Sort of like amateurism in college sports in this country.
Or the Olympics,
Right.
Right. It's interesting to me, right? So basically in 68, everything opens up and they decide, okay, it's going to be part of the professional circuit. And it reminds me of 1988 and the decision of when the NBA said, you know what, maybe we should have professionals play in the Olympics.
And if it's supposed to be a test of the best, right? We saw it with hockey, right? Starting in Nagano in 1998. Let's see the best. Let's have the Olympics truly become about the best and not just the amateurs. So in 68, the open era begins, and professionals, amateurs can finally play together. Prize money appears in the Wimbledon program, two M's and an E, and Laver comes back and he wins. And that's the perfect response. He basically says, you kept me out for 5 years, but guess what? I'm still the man.
So what do we think with Rod Laver? I mean, you talk about like Rod Laver with losing 5 years of Wimbledons. Ted Williams, in baseball is famously lost, and Willie Mays, both of them lost a couple of years with the Korean War, still have these all-time great statistics that in baseball, but there's an interesting what if here in Laver. I mean, Laver's already considered one of the all-time greats. Imagine if he has, say, 3 more Wimbledon championships.
Well, I mean, then Pete Sampras would not have surpassed him, but these other guys would have. That big 3 of Nadal and Federer and Djokovic, up in the 20s. I don't think even back then you just didn't have the sports medicine to sustain the way these guys have this late. And I mean, Nadal kind of barely did, but I mean, the fact that Djokovic is still going, and so I don't think he would surpass them, but maybe you wonder if Sampras would have been able to get past him, because Sampras gets 1 past him, I think, maybe 2 past him, and then never wins again. So 73, you've got this labor moment. Nikola Pilic is suspended, and the ATP, which is still new, the men's tour, they support him, but Wimbledon refuses to budge, and you have 81 male players withdraw. So now it's not just a tennis controversy. This is a Players Association proving its power. This is a war within the sport.
And if you think about it, let's put it in larger context. This is at the beginning of basically the sports labor movements in general, right? You had baseball and basketball and football all with these fledgling players associations, and you had this. Then, of course, this was the ATP. You also would later have Billie Jean King. But this was, we talk about the player empowerment era of the last 10 years. I could argue the mid sort of 65 to 80, right, in all of sports was really the first player empowerment area, and it hits tennis pretty hard.
Right, and it's hitting all these sports because television is transforming all these sports and is infusing all these sports with more money, and the stakes are becoming higher, and it becomes impossible to ignore, disparity. It's one thing, you can put up with something when there's really not that much money being made, and the money is pretty much limited to the tickets sold and the seats. But with this exponential multiplier of the finances that's coming in, the players aren't blind, and they can see what's happening, right? And so
look, for the most part, this works. Wimbledon sort of, it starts to, acknowledge this, but it was messy. You did have a young 17-year-old named Björn Borg who crossed the picket line and played, but for the most part, they didn't have the tournament they wanted, and they realized that they essentially had to start to treat the players, at least the male players, as equals. And I single that out because it takes them a while to equalize it across the board.
Exactly. And now let's talk about the gates in a literal sense, right? Mm-hmm. Who was allowed to play? Mm-hmm. And that'll bring us to Althea Gibson, who grows up in Harlem, Black woman in Harlem. Her family leaves the Jim Crow South, so the Great Migration northward. And anytime this comes up, I always have to recommend the book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which does such a great job of chronicling this, written by Isabel Wilkerson, the guest speaker at the commencement in Northwestern a few years ago. Althea Gibson, so she kind of comes up on this alternate path. Like a lot of doctors sponsor. There's sort of these tournaments that are put together. The doctors who have the money, Black doctors, have the means to provide and put these tournaments together. So she kind of makes a name for herself on this circuit because the white tennis establishment is close to her. There's something called the American Tennis Association, and that's sort of like what the Negro Leagues were to baseball. It's an infrastructure that exists because Black players had to build their own world.
It was literally the same parallel, like what you're describing, a parallel. I think about this. Imagine like it was, women were already treated as second class. Now black women in the sport, right? Like you're breaking through multiple barriers here.
And that's why one of the most almost criminally under recognized and under honored people in sports is Althea Gibson, who did
the double barrier
decades before Arthur Ashe. We celebrate Arthur Ashe, and rightfully so, for becoming the first black.
How come there's not Althea Gibson Stadium, right?
Yeah.
I don't mean that in any negative about Arthur Ashe Stadium, but it is,
right.
You're right. It's sort of, I don't want to say she gets lost, but it's almost like she broke through too early before we it's like, well, you did it before the civil rights era in some form or another. I don't get it. Do you?
Sexism. A lot of times it's as simple as that word, right? I think the sexism of it, the same as we don't talk about other female figures in the civil rights movement, to this, I don't want to say overt, because we can probably never pay enough tribute to Martin Luther King, but in some senses, relative to the work that the women put into the movement, there's an over-indexing of Martin Luther King, right, relative to the work that the women put in. And I think it's the same with Althea Gibson when we compare her to a Jackie Robinson, and she's in that same time.
I was just going to say, Jackie's in 47. Yeah. She pushes through
in Wimbledon in 51.
Yeah.
Wins it in 57 and 58. Right. If you're looking around, so the NBA integrates in 1950, the NFL in 1946.
Year before baseball, which people always seem to forget.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, to be a black woman, but let's give Wimbledon credit, for not being too far behind the times, right? Maybe they weren't the first, but they're not lagging way behind, like say Augusta was, which didn't have a black player in the tournament until 1975.
Right.
So, again, Wimbledon not leading the way, but Wimbledon not lagging too far behind.
So here we are, 1957. She wins Wimbledon, and the Queen of England presents her the trophy. That's a pretty big. That's a visual.
Yeah, here's a black woman from the American South by way of Harlem, receiving the Wimbledon trophy at center court from the Queen of England amid all the tradition-laden that goes on at Wimbledon. The day she wins, London's in an extraordinary heat wave, similar to what Europe is experiencing as we're recording this in the summer of 2026. It's 96 degrees, almost unimaginable for an English summer. It's funny. I was there in 2000, summer of 2000, covering the British Open in Wimbledon. And it was like in the high 70s, and they were freaking out. Like people were like passing out from heat stroke, sunburning.
And you're sitting there going, this is great. Right. July, 70s, awesome.
Yeah. So 96, you can just imagine London when there was probably virtually no air conditioning at the time. But so she wasn't just carrying the pressure of history, right? She was doing it in this brutal heat against Darlene Hard, who had been her doubles partner. She went 6-3, 6-2, and then as Queen Elizabeth II hands her the trophy, Gibson reportedly says, at last, and that could have meant a lot of things and been interpreted in a lot of ways. And again, a full decade before Martin Luther King closes his famed "I Have a Dream" speech with the words "free at last."
For all we know, she was just like, at last I get a drink of water after that match.
But those words, as Martin Luther King says in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last. And again, 2 decades later, Arthur Ashe. But this, again, speaks to the power of Wimbledon, because if I say Arthur Ashe, to most people, probably what comes to mind is the first black man, again, not black person, but black man to win at Wimbledon, even though that was his third of the Grand Slam championships that he won. He won it.
Shows you how important Wimbledon is. It's like you didn't really accomplish anything. Right. You could win all the Australian Opens in the world, and if you don't win Wimbledon, you haven't done anything in tennis.
And so he won one of those. He wins the U.S. Open in 1968 in a classic match in the first Open of the Open era, right? And at the old site at Forest Hills. And so, but this was kind of the thing that really put him on the map, I'd say, and became his calling card. He's someone comes out of Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. Yeah. It says a lot that a statue of him goes up alongside all the Confederate generals and leaders that they had up on on that
In
famed
the
avenue.
same, it's weird that it's in the same little area, but yes.
Yeah. He's mentored by the same doctor who helped Althea Gibson, Dr. Walter Johnson. And he really becomes not someone who just, and I think this is part of the reason, and again, there's the sexism, but also, the way he carries himself, is so dignified. Althea Gibson was, a little more kind of rough and tumble, kind of a tomboy, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And Arthur Ashe, really is like a dignitary and a kind of a post-King civil rights leader.
Well, you're describing Jackie Robinson,
Yeah.
too. The same sort of personality, sort of this goes back to the origin story of Jackie that Branch Rickey was trying to figure out, can he handle the incoming? Right.
And Arthur Ashe, to use modern terminology, wanted all the smoke, right? And goes beyond just fighting for tennis, becomes adamant about no athlete should be going to apartheid South Africa and, blessing them with their talents, or, artists shouldn't be performing there. You shouldn't do concerts there, all of that. He was very outspoken on that. And the year he wins Wimbledon, so he's already 31. And he beats a 22-year-old Jimmy Connors, who was the defending champion, younger, louder, the favorite player, and there was tension there because Connors had sued Ashe before the tournament. So this was not just a friendly meeting.
It's interesting to see that, and Arthur Ashe decides he's not going to just beat Connors by playing his normal game. He had a different strategy to try to, I think, wear down the young Connors.
And it's like the tennis version of the rope-a-dope, like Ali against Foreman, the rumble in the jungle. And so don't give the power player power. So just give him junk, slices, floaters, drop shots,
Well, he wears him out.
Flies.
I mean, and you can almost picture young, it's so funny. The most iconic Jimmy Connors moment is when he's in his late 30s, right? But, he was energetic at 37. 22-year-old Connors running all over the place, but Ashe did wear him out.
And wins
6-1, 6-1.
Yeah. Unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
One of the great thinking man performances in sports history. And with that, became the first and still the only black man to win at Wimbledon. So Gibson was about getting through the gate. Ashe is about walking on the center court and outthinking the whole power structure. But then there's Billie Jean King.
Billie Jean King. She is, in some ways, she's the one that breaks the barrier for women. It's tennis, really, all over the world. The WTA, right? The original 9. She leads the women to what would eventually become an equal moment in tennis.
And she's not asking the existing system to be nicer. She's saying, let's create a whole new system, one that serves us. This comes back to the timing element. So cigarette ads get banned from TV in 1971. And so Virginia Slims, which is a cigarette brand and marketed itself for women, is looking for a way to get their product awareness out there. So they sponsor the women's tour, right? You've got this major corporate backing for this fledgling tour. Of course, the slogan, "You come a long way, baby." And so, it matters at Wimbledon because Wimbledon, here's the oldest and most prestigious tournament, but it's not the first to get equal prize money. So for women to get their money, you needed the backing of something like this. So here comes this major sponsor looking for something. They've had this, the preeminent way of advertising taken away from them and shut off from them. And so it worked out pretty well for Billie Jean King and the fledgling women's tour.
Look, it did. By the way, I was thinking about this. You had Virginia Slims, which, for those of us of a certain age, it was you just associated it with women's tennis all the time, right? It was always Virginia Slims. And then you had the Winston Cup, remember, for NASCAR racing.
For NASCAR, yeah.
Because, again, it goes back to what you just said. The cigarette companies, they had to find another way to get their logo out. They had to find another way. And so while they couldn't advertise, they could title sponsor.
And of course, like the antithesis of sport, right? Sports, health, and good for your cardiovascular system. All that.
It's really sort of all things, like, is there a worse thing? Although if you told me that,
right?
I'm sure like there are guys that smoked at tennis tournaments that if Wimbledon ever saw you smoke, they probably would have thrown you out of the facility.
So again, the U.S. Open got there in terms of equal pay in 1973. Wimbledon, it took until 2007. It's funny. I actually met Billie Jean King for the first time last year, and I said, hey, I'm just amazed and in awe for everything that you've done. And her quick retort is, and I'm still going. She's in her 80s now, but it just showed you, like, she still had to keep going. Like, she gets equality at the U.S. Open, and it takes, until another, 30 plus years.
Well, it took Venus Williams. She writes this op-ed in the Times of London before the start of the tournament in 07, and she makes this public plea and makes this case. And then finally, her popularity and her voice is what took it. So it's it is quite. But going back to Billie Jean, J.A., she's another one like Althea Gibson. Billie Jean King, she's getting her dues. I'm glad I've noticed. Feels like in the last 10 years, she's getting the
movies and
getting the flowers she deserved at the time that we didn't. It's very similar to Muhammad Ali, right? Where in the moment she was treated as she's divider, she's ruining sports, she's bringing politics. You know what I mean? All these things. And Muhammad Ali was treated the same way. By the end of their career and end of their lives, you realize, my word, look what they did, and look at the dignity that they kept, while doing it. And I feel like Billie Jean is getting her flowers late, but at least she's here to get her flowers.
And it's so great she's hearing it directly from the people who are benefiting from her. Like, I remember Coco Gauff, got one of these 7-figure checks for, I think, winning the U.S. Open, and I think Billie Jean King was there, but she just was just looking at this, giant check, literally, and saying, "I'm really grateful for you for what you did, because now I got this big check to deposit in my account." So she got to hear it directly. So I when she closes her eyes for the final time, she will have a peaceful eternal sleep, knowing that she got the full recognition for everything that she did.
Look, not to give away Mount Rushmore's, but it, like with Billie Jean King, right? That is, you just say to yourself, it's possible she, if you look back over when women's tennis is 250 years old, she's still going to be seen as a founding mother, if you will, of women's tennis.
Yeah, you just can't extract her from the sport and just women's sports in general, right? Far beyond just tennis.
100%.
So this act was the story of the players making Wimbledon open its gates to the professionals, to black champions, to empowering women, to player labor, to the athletes who weren't just grateful to be allowed in, but they're strong enough to negotiate their terms.
Look, and this is what makes Wimbledon dynastic, if you will. It protects tradition ferociously, but over and over again, the players force it to decide which traditions are truly sacred and which ones are just old rules defending old power. And the fact that they can adapt
too,
the fact that Wimbledon can adapt is why it has staying power.
And then once the gates were open, something else happened that really helped bring Wimbledon to the place and the status it enjoys today, and that was Americans fell in love with it. We'll talk about that next.
All right, so we're two American guys doing a Wimbledon episode. So at some point, we're going to have to ask the very selfish question, how did this tournament become ours too? Because yes, Wimbledon is British to its bones, the All England Club, the Royal Box, strawberries and half and half, as HAA will tell you. It wasn't really any whipped cream, not Cool Whip. A dress code that sounds like it was written by someone's disapproving grandfather. And yet for American sports fans of a certain age, Wimbledon is now, and it really is of a certain age, it's the age that JA and I are. I mean, we were kids in the late 70s. Wimbledon is deeply familiar and feels weirdly, not American, but it feels like it's culturally a first cousin, for sure.
To the extent that the Beatles are American, right?
That's right.
Feel American. Yeah. The Rolling Stones came over here in the 1970s, right? Like eventually we absorbed all these things, right? The British invasion. This wasn't so much as an invasion as it was just a reaching out and an affinity for it. And I think the answer lies in three things. It's champions, television, and timing. So the Americans love winners, right, Chuck?
Yes, we do.
So Americans were going over to London and winning and winning and winning. So you had a rooting interest. Television gave Americans and it gave the sport exposure in America, and it gave Americans a ritual. And then the timing, we hinted at this earlier, it fell at a great place, a fortuitous spot on the American sports calendar, a pretty slow period on the American sports calendar, late June into July. And it made Wimbledon feel like seasonal appointment. So let's start with the players first. It wasn't just a moment; it was waves, right? You got the early American champions like Mae Sutton, Bill Tilden, Helen Wills, Moody, and Don Budge, and then post-war you get Maureen Connolly, Althea Gibson, and Billie Jean King, and then the Open era gives American television this incredible cast: Connors, McEnroe, Everett, Navratilova, who starts off as a Czech and becomes an American citizen after a defection. Ash, Sampras, and Agassi, Venus and Serena, all these big stars.
And really, since it depending on your generation, Wimbledon comes to you through a different American face. I mean, just you literally, if you're in your 60s or 70s, you've got a player. If you're in your 40s or 50s, you've got an American. If you're in your 20s or 30s, you do, right?
And the fact that, it could switch back and forth, right? So if the men were going through a lull, which pretty much the 21st century has been an American tennis lull, but you did have Venus and Serena to pick up the slack, right? And then you had sort of Chris Evert in the 70s until McEnroe becomes more prominent in the 80s, right? And then Sampras in the 90s. So you had this handoff back and forth, the men and the women.
But let's be honest, the real American marketing genius came from a producer at NBC, an unnamed producer, Breakfast at Wimbledon. NBC takes what should be a problem, the time difference, and turns it into a brand and an identity. You want to watch Center Court Live? You're going to get up early. So NBC says, so great, that's not an inconvenience. Let's turn it into a ritual.
Man, Chuck, just hearing you talk about it, I hear those notes in my head. The song is called World Champion by Keith Mansfield, and everyone who grew up watching Breakfast at Wimbledon can hum it, sing along. But yeah, it was brilliant television branding, right? Then just really embracing it. They made the time a part of it. Like, that sounds aspirational. Let's have breakfast at Wimbledon. If you knew how bad the breakfast at Wimbledon actually was, maybe you wouldn't be so excited to get up. But because you weren't subjected to that awful British food, you just got to wake up and roll out of bed and maybe stumble into the living room and turn on the TV. And then the brilliant green, the emerald of Wimbledon would be beamed into your living room. Along with
now, I want to give you. I know you love this next story here, and before you get to it, I want to talk about a brief history of what Wimbledon, what the television experience was like for Americans for Wimbledon before 1979. You have this great story here, and I don't want to take it from you, but just to give you a backstory. So it was in the 60s is when so. The BBC started televising Wimbledon, believe it or not, in 1937. There were so few people watching it that the makers of televisions advertised television sets in the program at Wimbledon to let people know that they could, if they couldn't get into the gates at Wimbledon, they could buy a television and watch it on the BBC. But it doesn't.
That's interesting because that highlights the difference between America and England, because originally, like, the baseball owners saw television as a threat, right? And the NFL owners saw television as a threat that, oh my God, if people watch on television, they're not going to come and buy tickets and we're not going to make as much money. But TV seemed to be embraced at Wimbledon in England.
So this won't surprise sort of American sports TV knowledgeable people, but the first sort of excerpts of Wimbledon were on the Wild World of Sports back in the 60s, and ABC would bring these sort of taped broadcasts. 1969 is when NBC officially gets the rights to Wimbledon. But between 1969 and 1978, Wimbledon is all on tape delay, and it's packaged, and it's, not dissimilar to how, this was for those of you that are younger than JA and I, this was like about half the sports that we got to experience as kids came to us prepackaged or on tape delay, whether it was the NBA Finals, whether it was boxing, whether it was tennis, whether it was golf, if you were watching the British Open, everything, or the Olympics.
Games on college football. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, NBC was doing it with the Olympics, accounting for these different time zones around the world, really into the 21st century, surprisingly, until social media basically forced them to stick with everything live.
But this is what happened, right? Which is the American players in the early 70s start to become the stars of tennis. We just told you, Arthur Ashe wins Wimbledon in 75. Billie Jean King is one of the dominant women's players. You have a young Chris Evert. You have a young Jimmy Connors. You have this up-and-coming star in John McEnroe. So there was suddenly, NBC decided, you know what? There might be an audience here for live coverage. Let's give it a shot.
And one of the problems, though, was that it's kind of interesting that NBC could boss around the Olympics and change starting times. So you might get, a swim gold medal match might start at like 8 a.m. in Beijing to accommodate the American TV time zones. But Wimbledon, they weren't budging. They were doing their noon start for the championship. Doesn't matter what that meant for American TV audiences. And they didn't want to budge on when NBC, with their first breakfast of Wimbledon in 1979, it's the Björn Borg versus Roscoe Tanner in the final. And they just wanted to do a little 5-minute intro to kind of set the stage. NBC became really famous for those in the 90s with the NBA and NBC. They just wanted something similar, just like a tone setter to build excitement in the match. And the producer, Don Ohlmeyer, pretty famous producer at NBC Sports.
Don Ohlmeyer, by the way, who Tony Kornheiser loves to talk about all the time, because it's Ohlmeyer who made the famous quote that says, all of your problems can be solved with one thing, money. Or the answer to most of your problems is money.
Except at Wimbledon.
Except at Wimbledon, right.
Because despite all the money that NBC was paying for the American TV rights, Wimbledon said, no, you cannot have a 5-minute delay. And so that day, though, it just so happened that Donald Dell was an NBC commentator, but he was also Roscoe Tanner's agent.
I love this.
The Procer agency represented, most of the tennis stars of the 70s. Also was where David Falk was working when he signed his client, Michael Jordan, in 1984. Right. Donald Dell he switches from commentator mode to agent mode, and he gets his client, Roscoe Tanner, to take a bathroom break right before the match. Or ostensibly he's taking a bathroom break. Really, he goes and hides out in the back of the men's locker room. And so, buys him the necessary time. Meanwhile, he's in there so long that there's a Wimbledon official going in there saying, "Oh, Mr. Tanner, where are you, Mr. Tanner? We're ready for you. Mr. Borg is ready." So having sufficiently delayed the start of the match so NBC could get their little preview in, he comes out.
I'm not going to go down the road as an ex-NBCer. The legend of Don Ohlmeyer is what it is, but there's a reason why you have the phrase, the legend of Don Ohlmeyer. These are the type of things that made him a legendary television executive. The good and the bad. Look, I'm not going to, there's other ways that Ohlmeyer caused some controversy later on down the road. We're not going to get into it here, but this is why there is the word legendary television executive applies.
There's a reason.
To Mr. Ohlmeyer. Well, look, there's one other person that I want to give a little bit of a shout out to here, because for at least for those of us of a certain age, breakfast at Wimbledon, and you woke up, it was summer, everybody and you got to see Bud Collins wearing crazy looking pants that looked like they were designed by a kaleidoscope or something. And Bud Collins, I think, is an incredibly important narrator here for bringing excitement. I mean, I'll say this, I think John McEnroe brings a very similar energy to these broadcasts, but I think he learned it from Bud Collins. And this is what's great about Bud, is that Bud was both a legendary sports writer from, guess where, the Boston Globe. His career, he was both a tennis nut, he taught tennis. Even while he was an intern at the Boston Herald, he was like a local tennis coach for a little while. but he started doing tennis commentary for public television in Boston in the 60s. And so that's why he was one of the few sports journalists who also had some TV chops, which is why NBC hired him. And, you know, what Dick Vitale did for college basketball on television, arguably is what Bud Collins did, I think. Don't you think?
You can add to that list John Madden for the NFL.
And Madden, yep.
Don Cherry with Hockey Night in Canada, yep. Right? These people who, really helped elevate the sport and were a conduit and were enthusiastic cheerleaders. So enthusiasm. And I can tell you, just like
it was contagious.
Yeah, like that it's genuine. It's not an act.
It wasn't an act. Hyper dandies, right? Yeah.
Bud sat in my little section when I was when I covered Wimbledon for the first time, and that enthusiasm. So the day the tournament started, he's in there. We all had phones at our desk, and his phone would ring, and he'd pick it up and answer and say, "Wimbledon, first day." He was just floating on a cloud because this was his time. So, Bud Collins was tennis on TV for American audiences.
Yeah.
But again, even for him, so well-versed in tennis, you could tell Wimbledon was it. Like, this was Christmas for him, right? In the middle of July, Wimbledon, that was it.
And again, and maybe it's because you and I are both are sort of ink-stained wretches that did television too. I mean, what I loved about Bud and what he did, and I in my own way, I've always said my coverage of politics, I wanted people to like what we were doing, not dislike what we were doing. Bud Collins made me want to play tennis, and I had no interest in tennis. Like, that's how enthusiastic he was about. He made it more compelling. He just did.
So Bud Collins aside, and his crazy pants, his pants were the equivalent of Craig Sager's jackets.
Yep.
But the broadcast was more formal and more ceremonial. So you could tell, even through the television, that there was something special about this place, right? And here's also where tennis has this contradiction, though, because the packaging is elite, the clothes, the accents, the Royals are a private club, but the competition, it's lonely. You're by yourself, and there's no running back to pick up a blitzing linebacker. There's no teammate that you can pass off to, or there's no teammate that can grab the rebound and pass ahead to you. Right. Baseball, you get another at bat tomorrow, but tennis is just you. And it's funny that there was a mentality I had to adapt when I was there, because I realized, if you have one bad day, one bad outing in Wimbledon, you're done. Your tournament's over. You're going home. Right. So I really tried to adapt that mentality when, you got to bring it every day with your stories. For the whole 2 weeks you're there, I was like, you got to bring it every day, because if a tennis player, one of those people out there on the court, doesn't do it, they're going home. So I tried to be like a tennis player.
Look, no coach. You don't even when there's a timeout, you can make, I guess, eye contact with somebody in the crowd, right? And maybe do Morse code, right? Stuff like that. There's no clock, although maybe there's some expectation you come back from your water break there a little bit. You don't have a teammate. You don't have a substitution. And now, with especially that we're putting everything electronically, you won't even have any umpires to blame anymore, right? Like, it is, in some ways, with the video reviews, there is nobody to blame but yourself.
And I think it's that notion, that primal, one-on-one. And I think that's why there's such a difference between, we revere singles. We don't really care that much about doubles tennis, right?
We never have. Yeah.
There's something about that.
Even like watching the Williams sisters, you'd think, oh, that would be compelling.
It's not the same as watching them play each other, for example.
Right.
Maybe that speaks to the individualism of Americans. And maybe that's like why we keep getting our butts kicked in the Ryder Cup, because that calls for teamwork, and the Americans can't shift from that individual element.
Hey man, we're I always say we're all libertarian at heart in America, right? Because we came here escaping some group, right? Some entity to, whatever it is. Everybody came here to strike out, quote unquote, on their own, right?
And the thing about tennis is that it has that it has that you're competing against somebody, so it is like boxing. You're going head to head with someone, but parts of it are like golf, where you're just it's just you competing against the contours of the court, right? There is nothing preventing you from getting your serve in, right? It's, especially
there's nobody blitzing.
Everyone has
Like
to be
imagine,
quiet.
right? Imagine if somebody could rush you while you were serving,
Right?
right? Which is what, right? Nothing like that.
No one in the crowd can do anything, right? Quiet, please.
They get kicked out. Yeah.
So in that sense, it's like golf, right? Like there's nothing preventing you. There's no one preventing you from hitting a great drive right down the middle of the fairway, except for yourself. There's nothing preventing you, but we've seen it, right? When the serve starts to get a little dodgy, the pressure goes up, and all of a sudden you can't get that first serve in. And now there's that pressure to get the second serve in, right? So it's that watching someone struggle against themselves is part of the fascination of tennis. And I think one of the things that helped it play well here in America.
Well, let's talk about, you brought up golf, and I think this is a good time for an aside on the Masters, meaning because the best American comparison to Wimbledon is the Masters, right? If there's one U.S. sporting event that has the tradition, quirks, and rules, and controlled imagery and reverence for place, it is Augusta, right?
Absolutely, and they all kind of have their quirks or their traditions, So the Masters is the green jacket, and Wimbledon it's all white. Masters has amen corner, Wimbledon has center court. Masters has pimento cheese, Wimbledon has strawberries and cream. Masters says no phones, no running. Also, you're not allowed to run.
Yeah.
Wimbledon has no visible courtside advertising. Maybe a little Rolex logo on the scoreboard. That's it. But yeah, there are certainly a lot of similarities.
Now look, Wimbledon does have the Royal Box, but it also has the queue, right? Its center court seats cost a fortune, and people have to camp out overnight just with a chance to get in, which is similar to how the Masters can work. So, and both have these similarities. They're private member clubs that created tournaments that became global television events.
But with Wimbledon, it's elite, but it's not completely closed, and it's commercialized, and it doesn't look commercial. I'd say that for the Masters too, right? They restrict the amount of commercial breaks and limit the number of sponsors, so it's not too gaudy and tacky. I would say that the queue is cool. This notion that you wait long enough.
Anybody can technically get it. Yeah, and if you wait.
What I also like though is that when circumstances force things upon them, they formed a new tradition and became more accessible. And I'm talking about the People's Sunday, which started in the 90s. Well, normally Wimbledon takes the middle Sunday off. There's no matches, no play.
Even if there were all sorts of rain delays, they kept that to the point of where players were kind of annoyed by it. Like,
but it
come
reached
on.
the point one year.
Yeah.
Some say 99, some say 91. I tend to go with 91 because I remember it being a thing when I was there in 95. So there's one year that there was so much rain, they were just hopelessly behind on schedule. So they broke tradition at the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club, and they played on the middle Sunday. And they hadn't sold any seats in advance, right? Because they weren't supposed to be there. So they just said,
this was anybody could come.
First come, first serve. Have at it, even in center court, right? There were no pre-sold. So if you got there early enough, you could get in, and you could get.
So is it like when the caddies got to swim in the pool in Caddyshack that day?
Exactly,
right?
That's exactly what
running in.
Like. But it was a huge hit, and you know what you had, Chuck? You had people doing the wave in center court.
That's fantastic.
Heaven help us, But there was so much enthusiasm, and rather than recoil in horror, the powers that be at the All England Club decided that, hey, maybe we should make this a regular thing. So they repeated it in other rain-shortened years, and then they made it a regular thing. And so in 2022, it's a permanent feature. That middle Sunday is the People's Sunday. So I think that's something pretty cool, and that's adjusting, and it's turning a negative into a positive and saying, this works. Let's keep this going.
Now there's this. There might be some belief that somehow Wimbledon was anti-commercial. It was never anti-commercial. As we told you, the very first tournament, they're selling tickets, right? This was about raising money. So the business of Wimbledon is fascinating because of that. It wasn't anti-commercial. You could call them, They were just very particular about how commercialized they would get. So there are no visible courtside advertising boards, right? There's no baseline logos. There's no giant signage that assaults your eyes, but you do see recognizable logos. I mean, Rolex is impossible to ignore. Schlesinger is there. Robinsons, we're going to get into Robinsons in a minute, is there. Debentures are there. And of course, the broadcaster brands are there.
Yeah. In terms of that Robinsons, though, so before you had Gatorade, and we talked about the brandy, but you also had Robinson's barley water,
which actually is a real thing, like a hydration idea,
right?
Yeah, not just like a funny thing. Yeah.
So the story is in 1935, the dressing room staff at the All England Club mixed barley water and lemon as a way to help the players deal with hydration, and that's how it started.
And it actually worked well enough that players kept wanting it. And, it seems like a quaint tradition, but it was actually 1930s performance science. Again, before there was Gatorade, there was barley water. Doesn't sound very appetizing, I'll be honest. Hey, man, I'm in a hot day. Give me some of that barley water. Those of us thought barley water was beer, right?
Hops and barley, right?
Hops and barley, exactly.
So, another thing with Wimbledon, though, is it looks old, but it's not anti-modern, right? You had radio early there on that. They're early on television. They're there with Hawkeye. They broke down and put the retractable roof on center courts, sub-air drainage to get the water off center court, global broadcasts, all these elements.
Look, we told you about it earlier. So why did they decide to take out pandemic insurance? They lost Wimbledon in 2020. It was July. You guys remember the Delta variant, if you guys have all buried your COVID PTSD, you don't remember the Delta variants, but that was peak, right? So there's no Wimbledon. Well, the reason Wimbledon took out pandemic insurance is they took it out after the SARS epidemic and near pandemic of 2003, and turned out to be really prescient. Wimbledon ends up with an enormous insurance payout. It just shows you how, frankly, operational and protective they were of the tournament.
Yeah, dynasties become dynastic because they're thinking ahead, right?
Yeah,
and so this is the ultimate example of thinking ahead. I mean, they almost got caught, but they were, about a decade and a half ahead of their time when they thought that, hey, if something like this comes about, we better be prepared. Much more so than the United States government turned out to be.
I was just going to say, a tennis tournament in Wimbledon for 2 weeks is a little more prepared than the U.S. government.
Wimbledon, by thinking ahead, by taking all these carefully planned steps, it had become a global media property. It become an American television ritual, a business machine, and it's still got a private club party feel to it, all simultaneously.
So once you have a stage, the money, the audience, the tradition, the pressure, the only thing they got to deliver every year is the drama. And that is what we could tell you all you want to know about how this thing got started. But ultimately, Wimbledon is defined by its rivalries and matches. And we're going to go through some of the best of all time right after this. As great as the location of Wimbledon is, as great as the history of Wimbledon is, it would be nothing without the matches, without the rivalries. And look, let's be honest. We talked about the birth of Wimbledon's influence on the American culture was thanks to television, was thanks to the late 70s, but it was also thanks to, arguably two rivalries that really defined Wimbledon from arguably 1980 to 1985. On the women's side, it was Martina and Chris, and on the men's side, it was Borg and McEnroe, with maybe an honorable mention for Mr. Connors.
And in preparing for this, I read the book Epic: John McEnroe, Björn Borg, and the Greatest Tennis Season Ever, and also listened to the podcast Biggest Rivalries of All Time, hosted by Kerry Champion, about Martina and Chris. And one thing that kind of I thought about, considering the four, so all four of these individuals are born between 1954 and 1959, and I keep coming back to the Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers, which examines how much time and place are responsible for who we become, or who these significant historical figures become. And in this case, the fact that they were born at all, when I heard 1959 and 56, it made me think of 1958, which is the year that Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna were all born. And they all kind of reached their peak. Michael Jackson's Thriller comes out in Off the Wall comes out in 1979. Thriller
is 83 or 84.
Yeah, 80, and then for Prince, 1999, I think, is 92, and then 82, and then Purple Rain is 84. And so, but I think it's not a coincidence. They all kind of hit that peak right around the time that would be the 10,000 hours or so that Malcolm Gladwell popularized, that's the amount of time for you to reach greatness in whatever your perceived field is, right? So the fact that these people all are entering their primes, their peaks at the time that Breakfast at Wimbledon is being established by NBC and becoming a thing. And in particular for the women, especially Chris Evert comes along right after Billie Jean King has opened the door. And she's perfectly positioned to walk through that door as this, she was modeled as the all-American girl.
The all-American girl. And look, let's not dance around this, right? Billie Jean, you can't help but wonder how much that Billie Jean King's sexuality at the time limited her popularity.
Right. Although, at first she wasn't out until later.
No.
Right.
Right.
But that comes. But certainly Martina Navratilova.
She wasn't trying to be the girl next door the way
Right.
Chris Evert was absolutely leaning in. I don't think that's fair to say she leaned into it. That might just be who she was, who she is.
But, but it's Billie Jean King and the entire women's liberation movement, right? And so the prominence that's afforded the women's sports, in a way that Althea Gibson, even if she had been white, wouldn't have had these opportunities and these doors open for her in the 1950s, for example. Right. And then for Martina, yes, she grew up, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, but the fact that she was in the Czech Republic and not the Soviet Union made a big difference, because the Soviet Union really emphasized the team sports like hockey and basketball, and they threw their considerable weight behind those sports, whereas other countries in Eastern Europe were more about the individual sports. So tennis could be highlighted. You think of Romania and Nadia Comaneci, the great gymnast, and, figure skating in some of those other Eastern European countries. So the fact that Martina was born, let's say, in the Czech Republic as opposed to the Soviet Union.
I love this what if from you. When we were doing our planning, you were bringing this up, and I was sitting there and wondering if she's a Soviet citizen, right, and raised in the Soviet system, they would have probably forced her to play another sport, because they didn't really at the time weren't pushing tennis. They might have pushed her into an Olympic sport, or might have pushed her into a team sport or something. You're right. It's an interesting what if, right? Just of, yes, she was born in a repressive area of Eastern Europe at the time, but she could have been in an environment that didn't even embrace tennis.
McEnroe, he, for this image of being a New York City guy, and they kind of played that up, but his family moves to the suburbs and they join a tennis and swimming club in 1967.
Well, if he's raised in the city, he never plays tennis, right?
Yeah. And so, it gets his first tennis lesson at age 8. And again, it poises him to sort of peak around the late 70s.
All right. I've one, before we get into the iconic matches here, I've got one other you aspect of this, and that is the advantage of being left-handed. Because this is coming up now, there is an over-indexing of great left-handed point guards in basketball now, and there's always, even though there's this lopsided nature of right-hander versus left-handed people in the country, in tennis, it seems on the elite level, we've almost always had a great right-hander versus a great left-hander. So Nadal and Federer, right? Yeah. Connors was a lefty. McEnroe was a lefty. It's funny. It's like, and there's something about being a left. You talk to lefties that are successful, and they'll basically, in some ways, because you're forced to use, you're more ambidextrous, you're forced into it more. because society sort of favors right-handed. I don't know what it is, but it does feel as if the successful left-handed athletes can, there's almost like an equal representation in the elite level as there is with righties.
So there's actually a discussion of this in the book and the benefits of being a left-hander. And I'm not well versed enough in tennis to really understand or explain it, but it has something to do with, your ability to serve to like the deuce chord under certain circumstances as a left-handed. So there are some benefits to being a left-handed server, and what that can do and how that, serving to someone's backhand as opposed to their forehand, all these things, right? So there's something to that. Arthur Ashe was really good at explaining, so Tiger Woods was great at explaining the technical. If you asked him to talk about sort of, more weightier matters, he would shy away from that. But man, he talk about the technical aspects of hitting a golf ball. Arthur Ashe was similar in this book. Like, he really breaks things down. He talks about the way what made Borg so good on grass, the way his shots would dip just as they crossed the net, made it harder to play him. He moves better laterally on grass than most people do. And Ashe said that there isn't as much adhesion to the sole of the shoe in the court on grass. How about that? So that level of detail, what made, Borg such a great champion at Wimbledon. So all these people just, there were just things about them that were suited to Wimbledon. There were things about them that, make them perfectly suited to take advantage of the time and the place of this boom in tennis and, this focus on Wimbledon in America.
All right, let's talk about the cathedral. It's within the cathedral, and that is center court. Because Wimbledon center court, there's Yankee Stadium, there's Augusta, there's Madison Square Garden, and there's center court at Wimbledon. And what's great about center court is that just like when Notre Dame runs out of their locker rooms, play like a champion today, and you hit the sign, there's something fitting about tennis that you walk under a Rudyard Kipling quote.
Yeah.
And you said you had the quote. You actually,
I had it somewhere framed.
Yeah.
Just as I've been moving, I just came across it. But yeah, Sampras was someone who really took it to heart. I think he read it like at the funeral for Fred Perry, something like that. He was one that really epitomized. Sampras just loved all things Wimbledon. He loved the fact that as a defending champion, you get the first men's match, and I think it's noon on Monday, the first day, right? You get that honor of starting off on center court to begin your title defense. He was just really into all things Wimbledon and playing on center court and the Rudyard Kipling poem "If." He just lapped all of it up.
The quote from the poem, and it just, there's, I read the Federer Nadal, the book about the great Federer Nadal match of 2008. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. And Federer, the more these guys, the more they play on center court, the more they win or lose on center court, the more that quote has more meaning to them, depending on whether they're doing well or not well, right?
Yeah, you can really take it hard, but you can apply it to so many things, right? I love it. There's also the notion of the ghosts, right? Yankee Stadium, you hear about them, the old Boston Garden, or, now Madison Square Garden, and that Wimbledon certainly has its as well.
Look, center court was bombed during World War II, and they rebuilt it. That in itself. So here we set you up in the cathedral. What's really great about Wimbledon is that every generation can claim its own match as the defining match of their generation, right? Where were you when Borg and McEnroe played the great tiebreaker? Where were you when Becker won at 17? Where were you when Venus and Serena took over? Where were you when Federer and Nadal played into the dark? Where were you when Djokovic beats Federer, right? And depending on how old you are, depends on what you think the greatest match is. And let's be honest, Jay and I are Gen Xers, which means the first match in our head is going to be Borg McEnroe 1980. And this is one of my favorite things, because if you ask the average American who remembers this match, who won, I promise you, most people would get it wrong.
Yeah, especially because Borg comes out in the first set and smokes him 6-1. Or I'm sorry, McEnroe beats Borg 6-1.
Yep.
It looks like it's going one way, but then Borg steadily fights back, and the fact
they
that
were great.
also McEnroe wins the most famous set of that one is too, right? The fourth
he wins the fourth set. He stays off
tiebreak.
Right. He stays off championship points after championship point. Looks like Borg is going to win. It's all about, I think at this point, Borg's trying to win his fifth in a row at that point, or fourth in a row, I think, at that point. And what's interesting, in some ways, the legend of John McEnroe is born in some ways because he lost this match. Ultimately.
And, he kind of, I think he won over the people though. That's a big part of it too. Because like I said, they're booing him when he comes out. They've got no.
They don't like his style. They don't like the loudmouth Yankee, right?
Mac and Brad, I think, is what the tabloids. That's something we have brought up, the fact that the tabloid press is a character at Wimbledon. I mean, they can take over. They can like hound people into submission and run them out and make them leave the tournament early because the relentless pressure, especially at a time when newspapers occupied a more prominent place in the media sphere. And Bjorg was on the way to winning 5 consecutive ultimately.
So he wins there. What's weird, in the fifth set, by the way, we talk about the great 4-set tiebreaker, 18-16. McEnroe wins it, and it's one of those where you assume, well, that he broke Borg, but he didn't break Borg. Borg wins the fifth set, 8-6, mind you. Right? Like, in itself, what a fifth set. And even though Borg wins, McEnroe broke him. Because the career's never the same after that match.
Yeah. And Borg just eventually bails out, and rather than like, okay, I'm going to have to deal with this guy for the next few years, and that just doesn't seem that pleasant to me. So, yeah, we forget about him. We also kind of forget about him, how great he was. Because McEnroe stays around, even though Bjorn was a better player. Bjorn Borg was a better player. McEnroe stays in our consciousness because we see him every Wimbledon, we hear him every Wimbledon, right?
We do now, that's for sure. And of course his brother was a pretty decent tennis player. Wasn't John McEnroe. I say this, I know Patrick a little bit. He's a good tennis journalist in his own right. It was fun when the McEnroe brothers would play doubles and stuff. But you're right, Borg, and here's the other thing. Borg also, he ended up having his own. He had some personal issues, right? He had some money issues and all this stuff. And I think I would always claim that Borg was a better player than McEnroe, but McEnroe might have had the better career.
Yeah, well, just certainly he exists and occupies more of a place in our head. And some of that was intentional by Borg. He admitted that, there was more to him than you saw, but he very intentionally kept that cold exterior. But just as a way of paying tribute to him before we move on, Vitas Gerulaitis, who was a player who was in that era and was friends with both of Borg and McEnroe. At one point, so the big three was considered McEnroe, Borg, and Connors. Before there was Nadal and Federer and Djokovic, there were those three. And Gerulaitis was playing well, and someone asked him if he thought he'd broken through and was a part of that big three. And Gerulaitis says, there aren't three. There are the rest of us. Then there's Borg.
Well, that's how, he was the guy. And that is the interesting thing about tennis, right? Is that there really does feel like, even if there's there'll be a great rivalry, there is somebody that has the belt, right? Even during the Federer Nadal great match, and yes, Nadal won that match, Federer was still the guy holding the belt, right? He was still felt like, and because what happened, he's still the 2 seed, right? Nadal was still the 2 seed to Federer's 1 seed, who then goes on to win the U.S. Open later that year. It is so. In all of this time, there was always still somebody that felt like Martina and Chris. You're like, yeah, but Martina's won; she has the belt.
But it was Everett, right? Everett's born before. Martina grows up. She's got a poster of Chris Everett on her wall when she's growing up as a kid in the Czech Republic, and so that's the goal. She talks about how, she comes to Florida. and she's like seeking out Chris Evert. She like can't wait to meet her,
Yeah.
and then she's surprised and presently surprised that Everett had heard of her. That there's this Czech girl that comes. So they're initially friendly as they start off. It's a friendly rivalry.
It's the media that tries to turn it
doubles together.
right.
We know who it is. It's not just the media though, and certainly it was set up to be the All-American girl against the Czech, but
and it was a little bit of Cold War. Yeah, it always felt like there was a Cold War prism with which that rivalry got covered.
And somehow, even after Martina
became an American
America,
citizen,
which she's still considered, the representative of Eastern Europe. But what I didn't know until I listened to this podcast is that Nancy Lieberman befriends Martina and helps her train, gives her advice, and then also says, the basketball great Hall of Fame Nancy Lieberman says, you can't be friends with her. That's your enemy. You're trying to take what she has. And so
how very Larry Bird, like Larry Magic, like it becomes Larry Bird's mother's favorite second son, while Larry Bird's like, what am I doing? I can't be friends with you. Right.
But kind of what happens with Magic and Isaiah, though, who they're super tight until they go against each other in NBA Finals, and it fractures their relationship. And so this wedge comes in between them, and there is some coldness that develops after they initially were friendly. But also, Navratilova does surpass her, particularly at Wimbledon. And as this Wimbledon-focused episode, Navratilova clearly is the superior of the two at Wimbledon.
Evert won enough Wimbledons to make sure she's an all-timer.
Right.
But
she'll always win 9 like Martina did.
She'll always be second. And she even, her coming out moment, she does, what's interesting about Chris Evert is that here's somebody that faced both Billie Jean King in a final and Martina in a final, who are the two greatest by number of titles, women's Wimbledon contestants of all time.
We mentioned Boris Becker in '85, so he didn't have the rivalry. It's interesting. He faced Sampras in 2000, I think. So Becker, but he's not that old. He's like 20.
But he hadn't had a good run. That was one of those, hey, look, Boris Becker's back.
Yeah, he somehow makes it to the final, and then he just was no match. I remember at one point, Sampras just is blowing serve after Becker just closes his eyes and waves his racket in between points. Like I might as well do this because I got no chance of returning these serves if I'm trying. But Becker, those were his kind of bookend appearances in the finals. And at 17, he was this breath of fresh air. It was great for Wimbledon though, because here's this very
he brought power.
Right.
Don't you feel energy,
right? He's just all over the place, diving and he becomes the first German man to win at Wimbledon. And of course, the tabloids had a field there. I can't tell you the amount of Luftwaffe references and Blitzkrieg and all this stuff. Like the tabloids could never restrain themselves from making some type of World War II reference when there was a German involved.
What was interesting about Becker for me as sort of this amateur tennis, casual tennis fan is that the power, now when I think of Wimbledon, I think of that this is where the power servers can dominate, right? The guys that really have the powerful serve. And it feels like Becker is and I know he's not the first, but he really sort of felt like that. And in some ways, there was a time where I didn't love watching that kind of tennis, where it was just ace after ace after ace. Now, in some ways, tennis is incredibly, as athletic as it was in the 80s and 90s, it's somehow jumped another level. And it's just, in some ways, I think more phenomenal at the way that they have 120 mile an hour serves and they return them, right? Like you're just, there's incredible back and forth. But there's something about Becker that felt like he brought this power and mainstreamed it a little bit, at least for the modern era.
Yeah, I would call it energy. Less energetic was Pete Sampras, who was never beloved for as much as he loved Wimbledon. The crowd didn't love him back.
Why is that? Is it just he wasn't loud and bright color guy?
It's funny because they initially booed McEnroe, but maybe they just came to think of McEnroe as what an American tennis, like
Right. They didn't like boring. They didn't want the blank. Yeah.
Right.
They wanted
Like the
spicy.
British can do uptight, and I wouldn't call Sampras uptight, but reserved certainly. And like if you're going to have an American coming over here and beating our boys, like he should act American. Like if we wanted a stoic person, we'd root for one of our Brits here. So they just never took to Sampras. It was kind of polite applause, but I don't think
would you put Steffi Graf as sort of the women's version of that? Because you could argue, before the Williams, before Serena, and after Martina and Billie Jean King, I mean, Steffi was as dominant of about a 7-year run as anybody.
She was, and she was
also
so efficient. I think there's something with McEnroe was volatile, right?
Yep.
Graf and Sampras were just efficient. Fraulein forehand. I mean, you let her get that forehand on you and forget about it. So Sampras, Graf, and they were simultaneous, right? In '95 when I covered it, Sampras won the men's and Graf won the women's. So they come up in the same era. The Sampras Agassi rivalry, which Nike really tried to push, and it was sort of a thing, but they just didn't have enough meetings. And I kind of blame Agassi more because Agassi kind of fell off and he had that walkabout.
Right. We also left, and he also boycotted Wimbledon for 3 years because of the dress code. Right.
So that rivalry didn't get to play out very often at Wimbledon. So maybe Sampras would have been better beloved if he had the McEnroe to his Borg. Right.
My favorite timeline here of the recent era is when we were going through our great matches. There's another phenomenon here is sort of, I always love the passing of the torch match, right? And how often Federer was a part of one, right? Because when does Sampras's run end? When he meets a young 19-year-old Federer.
2001, 1 year after winning Wimbledon for the last time.
Right. And then Federer Nadal, right? He sort of, in some ways, it wasn't quite a passing of the torch. Federer basically, it was sort of it allowed Nadal to join him. But then you have Djokovic, almost literally, it's 11 years after the Nadal-Federer match is the Djokovic-Federer fight. And think about that timeline. 2019 is Djokovic-Federer, which is an incredible match. It goes, even this is after the 12, when they instituted it, they had to trigger the 12-12 tiebreaker in the fifth set. We just got through telling you about Federer's first title in 01. 18 years.
Amazing. Let's stay on Federer for a moment because he felt like the end game or like a fusion, if you will, because he had a Sampras-like serve and Agassi-like ground strokes. And it just made him seem like the perfect tennis player. It's funny. Sarah Kaufman, who is the dance critic for the Washington Post, wrote a column about Federer, which I've actually taught in my class several times or used in my classes because it's a great example of writing when there's no statistics to back you up, when there's just a feeling that you have. And so she made the case that Roger Federer is the most graceful athlete of our time. And it's
interesting. Graceful is a perfect word, right?
Yeah. And a perfect description. And of course, she provided the perfect definition and examples of what made him so graceful and descriptions of his grace. But that was Federer and just a special and kind of a revered place for a place that does reverence, or a revered person for a place that does reverence.
But what do you do? Djokovic, Federer, Nadal, right? This is one of the great, it's, you've got, we do this all the time with basketball, LeBron versus Jordan. It's different eras versus these three, which they all played each other and they all have 20 plus majors.
And you just wonder how many they'd have if they didn't have to go against each other, right?
I mean, you and I are sitting here lionizing the old Borg and McEnroe days, and those guys were great. But this most recent domination of this trio of men, and look, and we may have already seen the torch pass, right? I talk about the torch passing matches, Alcaraz and Djokovic. Yeah,
right. I mean,
and now we've got Alcaraz in center. Right.
And you wonder, like, there was that match where Alcaraz was out and Sinner was out and Djokovic got beaten. You wonder, like, if it's really done. Like, it seemed like it was all opening up for him to get one more Grand Slam.
And he couldn't do it.
With those two guys out.
Yeah.
It just might not happen. I mean, he did get another Olympic gold medal, a little bit surprisingly, right, in Paris. But but let's move to the Williams sisters, who were their own thing and who changed tennis. You talked about the athleticism that Becker brought, but the Williams,
they brought power.
Yeah, that similar thing to women's tennis. And what was
although
amazing,
I could argue Steffi Graf was sort of the first power.
She was a forerunner of it, but just the serve wasn't as big. The range wasn't as big, right? So she had powerful
certainly not like Serena.
The ability of Serena to just chase down anything and get it back over the net, right? And what was amazing to me was how they made Martina Hingis obsolete. So Hingis was this great player who was very skillful, but she just didn't have the power. So she had it looked like she was going to be the next thing. And I was actually there when she was having some of her first appearances at Wimbledon, and everything felt she was next, and she was just very poised and polished and just had a very precise game, and the accuracy on her shots was incredible, and she just didn't make mistakes. And then the Williams sisters just came along and just overpowered her, and she just had no answer. She can't get bigger and stronger, and so the game belonged to the Williams sisters. Lindsay Davenport was a pretty powerful player,
right?
You had to have that in your game. You had to have that type of athletic ability to compete. Now the serves got bigger. You used to be able to break serve pretty easily in women's tennis. If you had your serve broken, you just break right back. And it wasn't happening now with these more powerful servers.
The Williams sisters meet 4 times together. Serena wins 3. Venus wins once against her sister. But let's step back. Is there a better siblings? What other pair of siblings are essentially both Hall of Famers in their sport?
I wasn't ready for this one, but
I know I didn't, and I wasn't like, I've been, I wish I'd, gone deeper into this, right? But you start to, it's really, I talked about the McEnroe brothers, and certainly they played together, but Patrick wasn't John, right? But there was a time that Venus was ranked ahead of Serena.
Curry isn't Steph Curry.
The DiMaggios, it's probably, they've got to be collectively the greatest siblings. Here's the challenge for those listening. We'll be doing we'll take your questions and comments. If we're missing a pair of siblings, let us know.
There was a great moment at the U.S. Open, actually, when what we thought was Serena's farewell to singles tennis. But, as we're recording this, she's getting ready to come back and play in Wimbledon. Also want to take a note to give our best wishes to Chris Evert, who, as we're recording this, has announced the return of the cancer battles that she has fought along with Martina. They both went through cancer, and we thought they were both on the other side and can kind of savor and just really, look back and spend these times reminiscing. And now I'm sure Martina will be, by her side again and providing support as they go through. They each kind of had to take turns going through it and supporting each other. And now it's going to be Martina's turn to support Chris again.
They really seem like public sisters now, don't they? In their own way, just in the way they take care of each other.
We certainly want to, send our best wishes to Chris and our support. And, but simultaneously, we're excited about the return of Serena Williams, and excited to see, what she can still do in her mid-40s.
Look, I don't think we could. I feel like every time I feel like we've made it clear how great the Williams sisters are. Then I realized there's still things I left out. They have 12 Wimbledon singles titles together. Serena has 7, right? Venus has 5. From 2000 to 2016, and one of the two sisters either held the title in 11 different years. I mean, that's just, there's just nothing like them that we've ever seen. Yeah.
I was there when they faced each other at Wimbledon for the first time in the semifinals in 2000, and the place was going crazy. And the WTA put out a 3.5 paid press release about sisters and the history of the tournament and the tour. And that was the first time sisters had met in the semifinals, as you described in the very first Wimbledon women's tournament. Sisters met in the final. But I just remember kids were going around going, the Williamses, Venus and Serena. They were just like bopping around. Like the match itself, that was the problem. Like when they played each other,
their matches have never been great.
Bad. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there was just too much going on. Right. We talked about the mental aspect of it.
Yeah. The matches themselves, right. You never sit there and say, and I don't look, I'm an only child, so I can't get inside the whole sibling rivalry thing. I mean, and I have 2 kids and they don't really play sports against each other. That's a dynamic that I think is just unique that nobody can quite understand unless you're actually inside their heads.
And crazy that they won 14 Grand Slam doubles finals together. 14 for 14. Every time they made the final, they were winning.
Yeah. By the way, I do, I hated, I don't want to leave. I want to go back quickly to Steffi Graf here a minute, because I think I worry that we kind of glossed over. She is the only woman to ever have the Golden Slam. And you know what the Golden Slam is?
Yes. So what year would that have been? 92, I think it was.
She did it. She pulled it off in, now you're
92.
Yeah.
But
she won it.
Was winning Wimbledon, the Australian Open, the French Open.
All in the same calendar year.
And an Olympic gold medal.
Yeah.
I want to say it was 92, maybe 96. I think 92.
It is. And it's interesting. Again, I think that it's just a reminder that, it is, there's always another generation that's going to come and say, hey, we're going to top this. And there's no doubt the Williams sisters in some ways top Steffi, but Steffi was a dynasty in and of herself for a period of time. There's 3 other shout outs and matches in Wimbledon history that we have to talk about. One is the greatest fairy tale of them all. Goran Ivan Isavic. I really was practicing. Ivan Isavic. He is the greatest sports fairy tale maybe ever. This is the equivalent of a 16 seed beating a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament, right? His ranking was 125. He gets a wild card, which is what Serena Williams is playing under in the 2026 Wimbledon, and he wins the whole tournament. It is something that's never been done.
Well, he had this game or serve that was perfectly suited to Wimbledon, right? Where you could just serve your way through, sometimes all the way to the final, right? It's like in NASCAR, there's a road course specialist, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not good on the ovals, but put them on a road course and they're unbeatable. So like you put him at Wimbledon, and he was just well suited for it. So I covered him against Sampras, and so what Sampras had, so he had a bigger serve than Sampras, right? A faster serve than Sampras. There were whole service games of Ivan Isavic where Sampras just wouldn't even get his racket on the ball. Just ace, boom, 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 you're done. Next round. Game Ivan Isavic, right? And then, but Sampras was mentally stronger, and so Ivan Isavic, you mess up, you get a second serve, and every time you give Sampras a second serve, he was going to pounce on it, right? And then he wasn't going to make any mistakes. Ivan Isavic would just make enough mistakes to let Sampras have this little window that he was able to sneak through and get through. But Ivan Isavic was fun because he was just perfectly suited for that place.
And
if you could be well suited, if your game could match any venue,
right?
I'm not just going to say in tennis. If you had a game, any venue in sports, wouldn't you want it to be Wimbledon? A close second, I think, would be like Fred Couples always manages to do well at the Masters. I would take that as my superpower. I can play well at the Masters, even if I don't win it. I can play well at Wimbledon.
So even Isavic only wins 1 major title ever. And obviously Croatia, he's important. But he does get a young pupil to start coaching, a guy named Novak Djokovic. So he has been a pretty good coach, let's just say, as well as is holding this incredible record here at Wimbledon. I think you got Andy Murray, right? The Brits don't get to win Wimbledon very often anymore. As we've indicated,
every
his
77
victory,
years or so.
right? Every 77 years. And think about when Andy Murray, we talked about the dominance of Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic in this period here of the last sort of 25 years. Where really it's just been mostly those three guys. Andy Murray is the is sort of the Venus Gerulaitis of the crowd, right? He was sort of almost good enough. He'd make a few finals, and he beat Djokovic once at Wimbledon, and it made to the British citizen, it's probably still their most recent favorite Wimbledon final.
Yeah, if you weren't alive in 1936, that's the one. So it's funny because for so long, all the British hopes were resting on the likes of Tim Henman, and that's just not fair. Like it'd be like if you were dependent on the pre Nikola Jokic Denver Nuggets to win a championship for you, right? Like if the entire nation's hopes were resting on the Denver Nuggets, right, who were like a good team. Right. But they weren't going to beat the Lakers or the Celtics in the 80s. They weren't going to beat the Bulls in the 90s. So it was an unfair burden that everyone was hoping that Tim Henman, it was like he wasn't Sampras, he wasn't Agassi, he wasn't any of those guys, right? He just didn't have it in him. And Murray, to his credit, because he's not Djokovic or Federer, and he had to play in their era, and he somehow was able to do it. Like he should get bonus points. Not only did he end the British drought, but he did it in that era, which is super impressive. And with that pressure, you can feel it. I've been there in a match with a British player, like on center court. You feel the hopes with every serve and the letdown with every net court. It's just, it's too much for an individual to bear.
I feel like one other, it is, and I do feel like you could see that pressure on the British, because they want it so much. But there's one other guy that I feel like, if we're going to do this before we get to our Mount Rushmores, is John Isner, because he's been involved in two, and he's not really a well-known tennis player, but he's arguably written into lore of Wimbledon. So John Isner is the guy that's involved in the famous 70-68 5-set match, 11 hours, 5 minutes, 3 days. It was a first round match, so wasn't even a final or a semifinal or a quarterfinal. And he's facing this guy, Nicholas Mayhut. And it's just crazy. The fifth set ends 70-68. What's interesting is that Isner is also involved in the longest semifinal in Wimbledon history. So that 11-hour match over 3 days is in 2010. In 2018, he faces a tennis player named Kevin Anderson. It's 6 hours and 36 minutes, and it is the last time that they don't have a fifth set tiebreaker. He wins the fifth set 26-24. Okay. And it became the second longest Wimbledon match ever after the other one that he had. But it was Isner is essentially being involved in all these matches that convinced them to finally put in even the tiebreak rule for the fifth set in the final as well.
It's crazy because Isner is like a super tall guy too, especially in the tennis world. And so like you'll see him at the ESPYs or whatever now and then, and you see him and it just clicks. Like we're like, oh, that's the
you're that guy,
right? The marathon match guy, right? That's him. It's funny. I remember I was at ESPN headquarters in Bristol, and I was sitting at a desk, and I just had this little monitor on, and you're working on your stuff.
You were there. Tell them what you were there for.
Yeah, I was there for the LeBron decision stuff, right? So I was
the LeBron watch, as you call it,
right? LeBron watch in 2010. But I've got this monitor going on, and like. You want to see it end, but then you got to go do Sports Center or something, right? It just wouldn't end.
So I was in the middle. I was doing a daily rundown. Back Savannah and Guthrie and I had a cable show on MSNBC back then. We're in the makeup room. She's a big tennis fan, huge. She's a Federer groupie, as she will admit. And she wanted the tennis on. We're watching the tennis. We do our hour show, we come back, and they're still in the fifth set, you know? Well, as we try to land the plane, we have our Mount Rushmores to get to. You know, Jay, I think the reason Wimbledon survives is that, and why it's stayed Wimbledon, stayed special, is that it has figured out, it is, you know, sometimes in a forcible way and sometimes in an elegant way, of what's negotiable and what's sacred.
And not holding on to things just to hold on to them, just because this is what we've always done. I think the People Sunday and the Middle Sunday is the best thing. Well, we don't play on Sunday. That's not what we do. Well, sometimes you have to get the tournament done in a reasonable, timely manner. And also, it's a cool thing to let others experience Wimbledon, right? You don't want to be too exclusive where no one can say that they've been. And
Right.
so, you know, adapting with it, you know, the Hawkeye technology, like let's get with the 21st century. And you know, it's funny. You wonder how diminished the legend of John McEnroe would have been if he hadn't been blowing up at those umpires in Wimbledon. And you can't argue with a digital line, right? Or a laser eye.
But let's just think about just grass here a minute. It is more expensive. If we were just talking about how could Wimbledon make more money, profit more, they would say, just get rid of the grass courts.
But it wouldn't be Wimbledon.
Of money. That's exactly right. It is sacred. You couldn't pave over the grass, right?
You can put a roof on center court, but you can't put a hard court on center court.
Yeah.
And I think that's there are lines that are drawn, right? And they'll be flexible for the sake of, you know, being pragmatic. And you're right. The court, you know, especially as the tournaments expand, I don't know how many people they had originally, but the tournament is so big with men and women now, and the court gets so worn out, even center court, which they try to preserve some bit, but by that final championship weekend, it's rough out there, you know, and it's worn down. So you're right.
Let me throw one idea
at you. It might be a better
you.
tournament, actually, if they got rid of grass. Or they put synthetic grass. How about that?
Well, here's another. So here's a challenge to Wimbledon about whether this would be negotiable or break a sacred. You know how, and I know that this is done, I believe, at the Phoenix Dome, and which is they grow the grass on the outside, then they roll it in for the game. Can you imagine if Wimbledon borrowed that technology where you essentially grew your grass court was maintained off-site, and they rolled it in the way, you know, on some indoor football stadiums, they roll in the grass. You think that would be a break of tradition or not?
I don't think you're still playing on grass, and I don't think anyone would complain about having.
And it would improve. Surface. It would be a better surface for the final. Yeah,
just visually too, aesthetically. We talked about the importance of television. Like, it just looks better aesthetically to have a nice, you know, even grass throughout the court, you know, rather than it worn down on the baselines and in the middle on the tee. So you wonder if they would do that, you know, but you have to keep the grass. It's funny. The U.S. Open had no problem moving locations and going from grass to hard court, because why? It wasn't Wimbledon, and it's its own thing, right? And it's got its own feel to it, but it doesn't feel classic.
Look, and this is true of the French Open, right? If they got rid of the clay courts, what would make the French Open interesting? I mean, Paris is great, don't get me wrong, right? And the grass court, right? You couldn't get rid of it. But as technology comes along to better maintain it, I mean, it's already a different grass. And in fact, that was one of my favorite, you know, some players swear that the ball is bouncier now and that it does this now because they use a different grass, which is true. They changed the grass. They use a different grass seed starting in 2001 than they used to use for the first 123 years. So,
all right. We got only 4 on the Mount Rushmore.
Is that what we decided?
Yes, not
only
men's
4.
and
like,
women's.
I try to amend.
Not for women.
I just want you guys to know we're now, instead of yelling at each other, Jay and I, we're going to talk to you in the audience. I try to convince him of doing a Mount Rushmore for matches. I try to convince him to do men's and women's, and he says no. We've got to keep it. It is one Mount Rushmore. You only get
room
4.
for 4 faces on that mountain.
So look,
you want to go first?
All right, here are our rules. Let's just remember. So what are we doing here? We're going to pick the 4 greatest or most influential people in Wimbledon history.
Doesn't have to be
And
players.
that's right. Not player. Doesn't have to be. So the
Right.
4 who shaped Wimbledon. So, all right. You want to do yours first?
Yes. I have a slightly
All right.
different. So I do have the 4 greatest Wimbledonians, or those who performed at Wimbledon, not necessarily the most influential. So it sounds like you want to do the people who shaped, which is kind of something that I've done in the past. But for me, it's who are the greatest performers on center court, which is what it comes down to. And so I've got Pete Sampras, who won 7 times, Roger Federer, who won 8 singles titles, Martina Navratilova, 9 singles titles, 20 titles overall. And my final one, she only won twice, but pretty significant in the history of not just Wimbledon, but sports, and that's Althea Gibson.
I have never had a harder time coming up with 4 so far that we've done, right? It was so like, I had maybe 5 or 6 Steelers to pick in my head for the 4, or maybe it was, for me, the 4 for the Warriors were easy for me. I had the hardest time, and I think the beauty of this is that we're going to have almost completely different 4s. I did Billie Jean King. I think she just, again, first of all, she's got the tied for the most titles, but she was, she opened the door. That I have Federer.
Here's the thing with Billie Jean King for me. When I think of the iconic Billie Jean King match, it's not at center court at Wimbledon, it's at the Astrodome in Houston.
I hear you.
Battle of the
it's
Sexes.
It's a fair point. It just feels like, she just, I think that's why I also have Martina. Like, the struggle I had is Federer versus Djokovic, and I didn't want to put them both in here. And I'm going with Federer just because I think the fans love him more, and I think that matters, right? There's this feeling you get when the entity that is the tournament embraces the player, and it's not fair to Djokovic that it's that way. It just is, right? It's the same way. Like Federer is not as embraced and beloved in Paris as Nadal is, and Nadal is never going to be embraced in London the way Federer is, or Djokovic. So I put Federer on there, even though I know you could argue that Djokovic is the greater. And I was going to cheat and put the Williams sisters on there, but I'm just going to do. I'm going to do Venus, because Venus is the one that got the money equal. Look, Serena's on the Mount Rushmore of women's tennis.
Right.
But if you're asking me, Wimbledon, Venus has had more impact on Wimbledon than her sister. Discuss.
So that's similar to me. I would put Billie Jean King on my tennis Mount Rushmore.
Right. Yeah.
And again, it's not like she hasn't performed at Wimbledon. I just don't associate her with Wimbledon, and so that's kind of, to me, part of it is like, okay, who are the people that I think of, and I think of greatness at Wimbledon.
Yeah.
And it might be ignorance on my part. It's probably because her greatest accomplishments were before I was watching Wimbledon.
And by the way, tennis junkies are going to say, I can't believe you didn't even talk about Margaret Court. And you're like, you're right. And Margaret Court, it is sort of punished because of just when she was great, right? Margaret Court was, in fact, beat Billie Jean King at Wimbledon, and probably one of it's to this day one of the longest women's finals matches of all time, the 1970s final. But it's hard to sit here and say that when you think of Wimbledon, she's one of the first 4 people you think of.
Yeah. So, we talked about people who benefited from their era. Margaret Court probably gets demerits in the public eye for her era when she came about. Fred Perry, maybe. Yeah. If you ask,
Rod Laver,
right? Yeah, Rod Laver.
What if Rod Laver plays the 5 years that he was banned from playing? Right.
Right. So those are our 4s. Would Wimbledon be on your? It almost has to be Mount Rushmore of venues.
That's an interesting. So if you did the all-time venues, right?
Center
and
court,
you did it with even if you did it through the American, if you do it through the American Eye, you're going to go Madison Square Garden is one, right?
Augusta
Probably
National.
going to do Augusta. I think it's Wimbledon.
Embo Field, or
is it the Rose Bowl?
Stadium, Wrigley Field.
I might argue the Rose Bowl more than any of the others, because of the Rose Bowl hosted a lot of iconic sporting events. You know,
concerts mixed in there too.
Yeah. So,
well, you know what? I'll say this: it's not beloved, but how do you top the LA Coliseum?
It's
two Olympics.
That's right.
The first Super Bowl.
Where it's about to get its third Olympics.
Yeah.
By the way.
So.
And Dodger Stadium in the LA Coliseum,
yeah,
I believe the largest crowd ever to witness the World Series.
I think we talked about this in the Dodger, but like a World Series, Olympics, a Super Bowl, like, can your stadium do that?
Yeah. No, it can't. But you're right. I think what we're trying to say, though, is despite going down a rabbit hole on the LA Coliseum, I think Wimbledon is that venue. It's one of the four. It is a Mount Rushmore on venue.
And it's certainly a bucket list destination. Again, I was fortunate to get to go there, not once but twice, even though I didn't. I just envisioned I had this desire to go there, even though I didn't want to be a tennis writer. You know, I wasn't sure how I could do it, and again, to not go once but twice, super fortunate. And yeah, you have to go there, and you'll just be amazed at how green it is.
Well, I mean,
Augusta National, it's just so green, and that sounds overly simplistic to reduce it to that. But that's when I think of Wimbledon, when I think of the All England Club, I just think green.
Well, but there's also something else here that I think gives it this, right? We live in a world where everything gets renamed, resold, rebranded, sponsored, streamed, optimized, monetized, right? Wimbledon, even in this era, has kept its distinct feeling, right?
And it's what the name just kind of elevated, right? Again, because it's the championships at the All England Lawn Tennis Club.
Well, it's intentional. They know what they're doing, you know. And this is why we believe it's a dynasty, right? It's a tournament that arguably props up an entire sport. There's no other tournament that does that. Enjoy the fortnight.
Quiet, please.
Look, as we wrap up, a big thank you to Steve Hall. He's our partner and executive producer. Andrew Sampson is the head of programming at Showboat Media, our production partner. Kevin Kennedy is our producer, and Meredith Violi is our chief researcher. Big reminder to you, follow us on social media at Dynastic Pod. You could also follow Boche, Adande, and myself on various social channels. Like and review, though, on the Dynastic Pod. We'd really love that wherever you listen to your podcast. And please like and subscribe on our YouTube channel and post some questions that we will answer in our next episode, where we will we'll have an interview with an iconic character from Wimbledon's past. And also, we're going to, in that episode, rank the greatest matches, at least the 5 greatest matches of all time in Wimbledon history. So we will see you on our next episode.